Welcome to The Breach Show. I'm your host, Donya Ziai, and we're coming to you live tonight from our Montreal studio. We'll be covering the Ontario election and speaking to people from across the province to get their views on the results and on what's next after the election. We'll be joined shortly by our regular panelist, Pam Palmater in Toronto. Our other regular panelist, Elle Jones, couldn't make it tonight. She is testifying before the Commission into Nova Scotia's mass shooting in 2020. But she's pre-recorded a spoken word poem that will be airing later. And here in studio with me is Martin Lukács, journalist and the managing editor of The Breach. Hi, Martin.
Hey, Donya.
So, let's get to it.
Well, we should say that despite being in Montreal, we're not just distant, aloof observers of politics in Ontario. Both of us grew up in Toronto, and you're a very recent expat from the city.
I am, and actually, both of us were immigrants to Toronto, too.
That's right. Let's tell everyone a bit more about what to expect tonight. While we won't be offering real-time touchscreen 3D graphics of the results, we will have multi-dimensional political analysis. We hope it will put to shame the bland punditry that you hear on the corporate outlets and the CBC. We'll speak with journalists, activists, scholars, and former candidates. The lineup includes journalist Linda McQuaig, writer Riley Yesno, economist Erica Ifill, climate activist Lana Goldberg, migrant justice organizer Syed Hussan, teacher and labor leader Nigel Bariffe, writer and activist Judy Rebick, organizer David Bush, journalist Jon Thompson, and last but not least, campaigner Myles Krauter.
It's a long list.
It is. Community organizer Sarah Jama unfortunately had to pull out today. So the results tonight, for those who care about equality and justice, will likely be grim. Mm-hmm. But you'll hear perspectives tonight that range from sober to determined to hopeful about the ability of progressive movements to shape the coming terrain of political struggle. So stay tuned for that.
Yeah, and for those of you who are keen to see the results live, don't worry, we'll feed your need. Starting at 9 p.m. when voting ends, you'll see our ticker appear at the bottom of the screen, and it's going to show you the number of leading or elected MPPs for each party. We're also going to keep you updated on key ridings, and we'll let you know as soon as the major outlets call the election. In Ontario, most ballots, as we all probably know, are counted by electronic tabulators. So that means that the winners in many ridings will be determined pretty quickly, probably within 15 minutes. And then the new government will likely be declared within 30 minutes. So let's take a quick glance at what the electoral map looked like in Ontario when the election was first called. We're going to throw up a graphic on the screen for you. You'll see Conservatives in blue, the NDP in orange, the Liberals in red, and the Greens are a tiny speck with their leader Mike Schreiner and his riding in Guelph. Now, because the NDP is traditionally strong in the north, where the ridings are also typically geographically larger in size, the colors of this map are somewhat misleading. But if we look at just southern Ontario in our next graph, here the progressive Conservatives dominate in the suburbs and in rural ridings. The NDP is strong in former industrial areas like London, Sudbury, Hamilton, and also Windsor and Kitchener-Waterloo. And things get even more interesting when we look at the Greater Toronto area. In 2018, the Conservatives were pretty dominant in the Metro Toronto area and the 905 suburbs, but in downtown Toronto, the NDP did pretty strongly. It's going to be interesting to see, Martin, tonight, whether NDP MPPs can hold on to those seats.
That's right. Now let's take a quick look at the 2018 numbers on vote and seat share as well. You'll see that in the last election, Doug Ford captured about 40% of the vote, which is usually what's needed for a ruling majority in Ontario. But he could go as low as 37% and still have a majority, which is a perverse result of Ontario's first past the post system, which is obviously badly in need of electoral reform. There are 124 seats in the legislature, so you're looking at 63 seats for a majority. The Conservatives currently have 76, the NDP 40, the Liberals 7, and the Greens just 1, but they're hoping to pick up another or 2 even. One of the probably noteworthy trends of this election, which has been mostly empty of any strong ideological or policy debates, has been just how little volatility there has been in the polling. and we'll see if that pans out tonight.
Yeah. So I want to now bring in our regular panelist, Pam Pometer. Pam Pometer is a Mi'kmaq lawyer, professor, and author. She's not a stranger to most of you who've watched our show. She's joining us from Toronto. Hi, Pam.
Hi.
So, Pam, while we wait for people to finish casting their votes, what has been your overall assessment of this election cycle?
Well, I'm wearing black tonight because I'm in mourning for the province. I have to ask myself, can you even call it an election, a choice, when you know exactly who's going to be elected? Like, it's so frustrating. It's so frustrating when you know that the majority of Ontarians don't want Doug Ford and the Conservatives, just by at least any of the polling numbers. But ultimately, that's who we're going to end up with. And we know what that means for every policy issue across the board. So it's really frustrating. I mean, I'm hearing it on the streets with people saying, you know, what's the point of even voting? You know, when they feel like it's a done deal, they don't feel like they really have a voice. Now, obviously, there's people on the other side saying, get out there and vote and make it count. And then there's others talking about strategic voting. So I think it's like I said, I'm in mourning for the province because I think we pretty much know what the results are going to be. The only real question is, will the Conservatives gain seats, lose a few seats? How will the NDP and Liberals shake out? Will the NDP still be the official opposition? Those are the kind of things that I think people will be watching, knowing that the ultimate result is pretty much known.
And I should say, sorry, I am very accidentally wearing this very conservative blue.
It's true, and my green should not mislead people. I'm not a partisan green supporter.
But Pam, I know one of the things you've been looking at is also some of the fringe right-wing parties that have popped up, like New Blue and the Ontario Party. Can you tell us more about what they are and what you make of them?
Well, given that this campaign was so utterly boring, you know, people weren't being engaged, they weren't addressing the issues. You didn't even see Doug Ford, you know, showing any of their people showing up to debates, things like that. So it's like, what could make this interesting? Well, let's go look at all of the splinter groups. So all of the disaffected family members of the Progressive Conservative Party. And you know, it's not even a new thing. So you have this Freedom Party in Canada that was set up in 1984 so they could oppose social programs like welfare. It was called welfare at the time, human rights, and they wanted to lift all restrictions on porn. So, I mean, that was back in the 1980s. But then as you get closer, you've got the People's Political Party that was instituted in 2011. And of course, they're basically your typical right wing, you know, run of the mill populist. But the funny thing about the People's Party is that this People's Political Party is that the National People's Party of Canada has tried to register a provincial affiliate of the People's Party of Canada in Ontario 6 times in a row, and they've always been rejected because the People's Political Party is too close in name. So they tried to have some negotiations, but that didn't work. And then you've got the Ontario Alliance Party in 2017, same old right-wing stuff. Then the Ontario Party in 2018. And these are all people infighting with one another. And then the new Blue Party of Ontario, that's like a real mess. I mean, that's literally stuff for TV. And then you've got the Populist Party of Ontario and the Ontario People's Front. The one thing that's common about all of them, anti-vaxxers, talking about freedom, and really talking about how the pandemic was created. Oh yes, the Ontario People's Front says that COVID was genetically engineered by the people who want to sell you vaccinations. So some of them are just way out there, but it's funny how they're all really conservatives just with the infighting.
This reminds me of like a Monty Python sketch.
Exactly.
And I mean, obviously, none of them were anywhere close to getting a seat, but I think even just judging the number of votes they get will be interesting to watch.
I mean, apart from the two incumbents that they have, so there's one. Both have been thrown out of the Conservative caucus. Right. So we could see both the New Blues and the Ontario Party making their entry, as it were, into the legislature.
Well, Pam, as you know, we've got a really packed program for tonight, but we'll keep coming back to you for all of your analysis and insight. But we'll leave it here for now.
Awesome. I'll be in mourning throughout the whole program.
You never know, Pam. You never know.
Yeah, that's okay. That's true.
Talk to you soon. All right. I want us to go to our first interview for the evening. While we wait for the results, as I said, we're going to spend the rest of the hour hearing from activists and expert voices from around the province. And yesterday, Martin chatted with Lana Goldberg, a longtime environmental justice activist and currently the Ontario Climate Program Manager at the advocacy organization Environmental Defence. Here's what she had to say about Doug Ford's record over the last 4 years.
Thanks for joining us, Lana. Ontario's election is happening just a few weeks after a deadly storm has swept through the province, a stark reminder of what climate breakdown is doing in terms of loading the dice on disasters. And meanwhile, Doug Ford has spent the last 4 years taking an axe to what climate and environmental policies his predecessors had put into place. Can you give us a sense of what Doug Ford's record on the environment has been?
Sure. So as you say, the government took an axe to existing climate legislation and the protection of nature. So I could start with climate. It weakened the greenhouse gas emissions target for the province. It scrapped Ontario's cap and trade system, which was supposed to incentivize companies to decrease their emissions. It fought against the federal carbon price for industry and lost, and then developed its own very weak, much weaker carbon pricing model. It ripped up 750 renewable energy projects, including wind and solar projects that were already under construction. And then on the nature protection side of things, we've also seen a lot of axing of policies. So, for example, the Endangered Species Act has been decimated to allow developers to pay a fee instead of protecting the habitats of endangered species, and to allow the minister to delay protections of newly listed endangered species at his discretion, and to remove protections of the endangered species that live in publicly owned forests, which makes logging easier. Ontario has also undermined the power of conservation authorities to provide expert review of development plans, making it possible for developers to destroy provincially significant wetlands and other natural areas. And then changes to the Planning Act and Growth Plan are encouraging municipalities to spread out and build expensive housing in subdivisions rather than building more affordable homes inside cities where people have access to the things that they need.
You describe a really multi-spectrum, relentless assault on environmental policies. Who does this serve? What interest is this advancing? I'm curious.
It's quite evident that the policies in place are meant to make it easier for developers and for big industry and for big corporations to make a profit. So to pave over farmland, to increase sprawl, and to allow logging and mining companies to operate in areas that ought to be protected. So, yeah, it's certainly in the interest of wealthy developers and big companies who are definitely already benefiting.
Speaking of developers, from reports that we've seen, developer friends of Ford are behind a highway expansion plan that the Conservatives are pushing. And in a real head scratcher, Doug Ford has claimed that the highways the government wants to build will actually be good for the environment. But Environmental Defence, where you work, put out a report that obviously there'd be a massive increase in car driving on Highway 413 if it's built. Can you explain what this highway plan actually entails?
Yeah, so this is Highway 413 is a completely unnecessary project, which would pave over 400 acres of the Greenbelt and over 2,000 acres of Ontario's most productive farmland, as well as forests and wetlands and all sorts of natural spaces at a time when we really need more natural spaces and more farmland. It basically goes from around Mississauga to Vaughan. So not many people would even be using the highway. And it would definitely increase emissions, about 17 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions it would add by 2050. It's not going to address congestion. It's not going to decrease travel times, only possibly by 30 to 60 seconds. So what is it for? Of course, it's for wealthy developers who own land along the route of the highway, and they're already actually building all sorts of warehouses and other industrial facilities. And it's essentially for, a gift to these developers to make a profit on these lands and to build it up more and to sell lands at a higher price.
If Ontarians have to contend with 4 more years of Doug Ford, as the polls seem to indicate at this point, what do you think it will take to fight for policies that are up to the task of combating the climate emergency?
It will take really serious organizing and campaigning just to maintain the status quo. Luckily, there are strong movements across the province, including numerous groups to stop sprawl on highways, to phase out gas plants, to protect water, to protect Indigenous rights. But I think we'll need more coordination and collaboration among environmental organizations, grassroots groups, Indigenous communities, in order to mount a serious fight back. And I think as well, we'll really need to grow the environmental movement to get more people involved and to work with groups that are campaigning on other issues so that we can develop a more intersectional movement to stop the government's assault on nature and also on people and communities.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Lana, for joining us. Thanks for taking the time, and fingers crossed for a better, decent result in this election. With Erica Ifill. Erica is an Ottawa-based economist, columnist at the Hill Times, and co-host of the Bad and Bitchy Podcast. We started by discussing the media coverage of Doug Ford, including an astonishing puff piece published last week by the Toronto Star on its front page. The piece came with the headline, "The Evolution of Doug Ford," and talked about how much governing has changed him. Let's throw that front page on the screen for people to see.
Unbelievable.
Look at that cuddly man. What's interesting is the Toronto Star have always been stalwart supporters of the Liberal Party, but this might be a sign of things to come with the paper's new conservative-aligned, conservative donating ownership. Here's what Erica had to say yesterday. So Erica, as a journalist and a media critic, what is your assessment of the media's coverage of Ford the last few years and then during this election? I'm curious.
What happened to the Toronto Star? What happened to the Atkinson principles? Did those just go out the window after the buyout? That's one thing. I think the Toronto Star is an interesting kind of view into how media treks rightward, and especially without certain what should I say, anchors like Atkinson's principles or whatever, those journalistic principles that were questionable when they were, I guess, analyzed in the first place or used in the first place. But I find the Toronto Star especially very interesting because they put out a fluff piece was it over the weekend? I feel like it was over the weekend.
I think you're talking about how Doug Ford has evolved. Last week it was a front page feature.
Into what? I don't understand how you can actually write that with a straight face. I mean, I think the media, our mainstream media, has a problem with challenging power. it placates power all the time, and it placates those in power. And what's troubling is that the media coverage of this election has been quite singular and quite vapid, to be honest. I don't know where COVID went. The media will report on COVID separately from anything in the election, and neither the twain shall meet. And to me, the opposition leaders have not pushed that enough. So then the media is forced to talk about it within the context of the election. This is a man who shirks responsibility at every turn, and who has been particularly absent at the biggest crises. There was a time when he was absent for COVID, and the whole thing was, where was Doug Ford? He was absent for Omicron. He was absent for the Ottawa occupation, and it's amazing to me how it's as though it's as though they don't check their own articles sometimes, because these things have been documented. At the end of the day, what this should have been is a roundup of all the way Doug Ford has failed. And so I think people like Doug Ford with that little guy shtick, even though behind the scenes he is all about big money, big power, and big business, as we saw with the inequitable sort of COVID closures, right? Big box stores were able to be open, and small businesses that may have sold the same thing had to close. So I think that when Doug Ford does things like takes a shovel and shovels a car out of the snow, but it's his policies to put the car there, I mean, that's earned media. That is Doug Ford doing something nice without context, and you're broadcasting it on social media, and of course that's going to help his numbers. Same thing that's happening with Pierre Poilievre.
Yeah,
he doesn't need to talk to media.
Let's shift to some of the themes in this election. Affordability is one that we're hearing from all the political candidates, and undoubtedly, price gouging and inflation are on people's minds. But I'm curious what you think about how the political parties and candidates are actually speaking to affordability, and how in tune is it with the kind of struggles that most people are having right now?
I think you have two sides of the same bad coin. Doug Ford will offer a reduction of user fees as placating affordability issues. Well, that doesn't really do anything for structural issues or anything like that. And what it does is it supports his base in the suburbs, right? So when it comes to sort of class and region and so on and so forth, reducing or getting rid of the sticker fee, or something like that, is something that people can hold on to in the short term, and they feel like somebody's listening to them, even though they're not really doing much. And the Liberals in the NDP have the opposite problem, which is everything structural and systemic and long term, and there's nothing for people to grab onto short term.
You mentioned the pandemic earlier, which for so many people kind of laid bare the inequalities in the society and in the province in particular of Ontario. Where has it gone to in this election? And
I don't know. Sorry.
No, and why wasn't it more of a factor in your opinion?
I think the whole political class decided that the pandemic's over and they're going to turn the page. Mm-hmm. And then media followed suit because, like I said, they don't challenge narratives really. And so what I don't understand is if you are the NDP and the Liberals, why are you not talking about the pandemic at every turn? Why are you not reminding people that Doug Ford took federal money, sat on it, and only used it to pay down the deficit, therefore sacrificing the lives of your loved ones. Do you see? I just did that, right? It's not that hard. Every second they should be hammering that home. And they haven't been, and I just feel like they've lost the plot. Like, it just seems like everybody's fighting the 2018 election, like the pandemic never happened. And I think if the NDP or the Liberals or both lose, if Doug Ford wins, then we really need to ask them some hard questions. The problem with not talking about the pandemic is that we're not talking about our public services. And this election really should have been about our public services going forward. We saw how hollowed out they were during the pandemic. It wasn't only hospitals, it was schools. And if you look at Doug Ford's budget, it doesn't talk about repealing the wage suppression bill, which is Bill 124 of nurses. It talks about schools and hospitals only in the context of infrastructure, right? Which also tells me that he has a big construction contingent in his base, right? You can make those links, right? That, like, no politician just does something because. And so, I think, we really need to talk about the operations part of it, which includes labor. I just think there's so many missed opportunities in this entire election. And I'm actually kind of disgusted with the way it's gone on, because these are so important and these decisions will build the trajectory of these services for decades to come.
Well, on that note, Erica, thank you so much for joining us.
And to think, I thought I wouldn't have anything to say.
That's never the case with you, Erica.
No, I don't know why I think that.
That was Erica Ifill, journalist and economist, speaking to us from Ottawa. You're watching The Breach Show. This is our live special on the Ontario election. If you like what we do and want to help us do more of it, please consider becoming a sustaining member. You can do that by going to breachmedia.ca. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel on YouTube to keep watching this show. It's time for another panel check-in, and I think Pam Palmater is on standby to join us. There you are. Hi, Pam.
Hi. I'm still in mourning. Nothing has changed. After listening to those two amazing people, it's just getting worse.
Well, so here's a question for you. You brought up strategic voting before, and this is something that some groups have been actively campaigning on as a means of defeating the Conservatives. What do you make of that strategy?
Well, I think it's interesting because it's not anything that I ever looked into previously. You just kind of heard strategic voting. What do you mean by strategic voting? But, there's actually websites now that combine all of the statistical numbers of the last election, all of the numbers of the polls, and they can tell you. And what's interesting about these strategic voting sites is they're all anti-conservative, right? So it's how to beat the Conservatives. So you plug in your area and it tells you what's the likelihood of the Conservatives being elected. And if it's the Liberals are way up here and the NDP are down here, even if you're an NDP fan, they're saying vote the Liberals because then the Conservatives will be out. So it's more of a way of taking away seats from the Conservatives in areas where that's actually possible. And I just find it interesting because you can literally plug in anywhere. So anytime any one of my friends says, I think I'm going to vote for so-and-so, I'm like, oh, where is it that you live? I'm just going to tap that in and, oh, that's a strategic vote, or no, that's not going to work. They're not going to get anything at all. So it's interesting, if nothing else.
Yeah. What do you think?
I'm encouraged by greater intervention in elections by progressive organizations, but I admit to always being a bit distressed by the approach. I think it would actually be probably better described as tactical voting than strategic voting. But to my mind, the first problem is that it's always Liberals who benefit from it. They benefit at the federal level and at the provincial level, and that's usually why they wholeheartedly promote it. As in this election, Stephen Del Duca is promoting it, and the NDP is not. And I think the second main problem with it is that it tends to kind of let the Liberals off the hook and encourage illusions about who they are. Of course, I know, Pam, you know this very well, but for listeners, it's important to remember that it was the Liberals who pushed the privatization agenda before the Tories. It was the Liberals who slashed social spending in this province so that it became the lowest of any province in the country. It's the Liberals who really forged and cemented a neoliberal consensus. If you read Dalton McGuinty's memoir, he actually admits that they were able to advance all these essentially right-wing economic policies because people trusted them more. And so I think my sense is the best approach remains offering critical and conditional support to the NDP, especially those, left-wing MPPs who come out of social movements and who advocate most forthrightly and passionately, for our agenda and our causes.
I can see that. I think that's there's lots of arguments, for and against, but then, think about it. It doesn't just apply to the NDP. So people who really like the Green Party platform, does it make sense to vote for them because that's your conscience and they may or may not get one seat if in your area voting Liberal or NDP, because a lot of them are strategically vote NDP, you could get out the Conservatives, which is the worst case scenario. So it's more like damage control versus here's where you want to see the province go. It's here's where we know we don't want it to go. Let's do some harm reduction, damage control, and so that we're not all in mourning tomorrow like I will be.
I'm sure there's a lot more we can say about this and many other things, but we will reconvene our panel again soon. Let's hear from some other guests in the meantime, and we'll come back to you in a bit, Pam.
Right on.
Keep on mourning. Next up, Martin, you spoke to Jon Thompson yesterday.
That's right. Jon Thompson is a journalist and author from Northwest Ontario. He's a co-producer of Canadaland's Thunderbay podcast, soon to be a mini-series on Crave. I reached him in Thunderbay, where he lives. Thanks for joining us, Jon.
Thanks for having me.
The North is often neglected in Ontario's political and media discourse, except for being presented as a kind of hinterland from which to draw resources. Without asking you to be a stand-in for all of Northern Ontario, what are some of the issues on people's minds in the North?
Well, I think it's important to start by saying that the issues are the same in some ways. The cost of living, the cost of fuel. Cost of fuel is more expensive up here. The cost of food is more expensive up here. And that just keeps on going as you go further north, all the way into fly-in First Nations. And so without a doubt, that's on everybody's mind. The cost of housing, while we don't have it the same way that you would in the larger centers, it has ballooned up here somewhere in the neighborhood of 40%. And so it is becoming more inaccessible than it was. We can't cry a river compared to Toronto, but it's all relative to what you experience. And so I think it's important to start with what we sort of have in common. The ways in which our social systems are failing us are a little bit more acute in smaller populations. The services that are available in small communities are just not there in many cases. And in many cases, we saw the Red Lake Hospital have to shut down its emergency department right prior to this election. And that's not the first time that's happened. But, Red Lake's a mining town, and there's really serious things that can go down in terms of injuries and in terms of the general overall lower levels of health that Northern Ontarians experience. And so what you're looking at is greater demand with lesser services available. And so that's certainly on the minds of everybody.
Speaking of provincial leaders, can you give me a sense of how Doug Ford and the Progressive Conservatives have governed, how their governance has impacted the North in the last 4 years?
Well, I think the first thing that has to be said, and this has flown under the radar for most Ontarians because they don't deal with most of the issues, but Greg Rickford has taken on the moniker of Minister of Everything. He's the Kenora Rainy River MPP, who was previously, you'll remember, a Harper cabinet minister. And they put in his hands, they put northern development and mines and forestry and Indigenous affairs and energy at one point as well, which is the case that's followed in many other provinces. They decoupled energy after some time. They ran forestry into there. So you have a minister who is doing all of the economic work, all of the political work on both the industry side and on the Indigenous side. And the whole reason that those are separate ministries is because those are separate political interests.
Let me ask you, the polls seem to indicate pretty consistently that we're due for another Ford majority government. What can people in the North expect from that?
Well, my heart's certainly with the people of Grassy Narrows tonight, if that's the thought. They had hoped for 2 generations now that they would be able to pursue a path that their children continue to tell them that they want, which is ecotourism, land healing, and the government insists on mineral development and forestry as the path to development in the Whiskey Jack Forest. And so it's really disheartening to see that they can go to the legislature again and again, decade after decade, and still not have that registering.
John, most of the North has pretty consistently had NDP representation. Can you explain why that is, and do you expect that to continue in this election?
Well, the NDP in Ontario has traditionally walked this very strange line between being environmental when they're in the 416 and pro-industry when they're in the 807 or the 705. And that kind of stood up for a generation or two. And I think we're seeing that fracturing a little bit. But it is still mostly the way the party stands. And the old guard in the NDP is still continuing strong here. The way that the NDP markets itself in the North is very different, of course. And the way that they account for that is that the North is different. The sort of exciting thing about the races in this election is that the liberal strength disappeared, and some of those major members disappeared. I'm thinking Michael Gravel in Thunderbay, who has cancer and has stepped aside after the writ was dropped. Bill Morrow, who is staying on as mayor of Thunderbay, who was 15 years in the other riding, and in Sudbury and the Sault Ste. Marie, we're seeing a real sense that the Liberals might not be as strong as they traditionally have been. And so there's a real opportunity for the anybody but conservative sort of voter to turn orange in those particularly urban ridings. It's not different up here than it is down there, in that the Liberals tend to control the larger centers, and the NDP and the Conservatives have the less populated areas. I don't think there's any chance that Solomamaqua will lose Kiiwetinoong, the riding that is mostly First Nations communities. But you know, some pollsters have the Conservatives coming out there. I don't see it.
Well, on that note, John, thanks so much for talking to us and giving us the view from the North.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Martin.
That was Jon Thompson, journalist and author from Northwestern Ontario. There have been a lot of important voices and issues that have been left out during this election cycle, and among them is that of migrant workers in Canada. Earlier this week, Martin chatted with Syed Hussan, an organizer and the executive director of the Migrant Workers Alliance for Change. He's also part of the Secretariat of the Migrant Rights Network. Here's their conversation.
So Hassan, Doug Ford, as a premier, has talked about taking care of our own first. Can you talk about his government's track record when it comes to the treatment of refugees and immigrants in Ontario?
So Doug Ford, as part of his elections campaign, actually back in 2018, said this. He said, "We're going to take care of our own first." And I think the next 4 years has shown that he is very happy to use racist divisiveness as a way to pit migrant and immigrant communities against other poor and working class communities. And on the other end, just a few months ago, he said that we only want hardworking immigrants to come here, not those people who are on the dole, which again is about the fact that they have been chopping welfare, they've been chopping ODSP, but the message that's coming out that it's actually immigrants and migrants who are taking advantage. And this strategy to distract people away from who's really responsible, which is government and the corporate interests that they serve, are the ones who are really the ones that have made our lives miserable, and instead try to get people to turn on each other. His track record on migrant and immigrants has been incredibly damaging. So right at the onset, they chopped legal aid for refugees, making a big deal about the fact that refugees were taking over too many provincial services, trying to force the federal government to come in and fill that gap. And across the way, when we think about the things that low-wage working class people in Ontario, a lot of them are either new immigrants or they are migrants. And these are people in low wages, and those are people who lost the minimum wage increase because of the rollback of labor laws. These are the same people who have seen the healthcare cuts, who've seen the attacks on childcare, who've seen the attacks on housing. So the entire 4 years has been about damaging working class people's ability to protect themselves, to feed their families, and to take care of themselves. And multiple either rollbacks of existing laws or policies, such as the one on minimum wage, or new laws and policies have been created. For example, this massive expansion of police and prisons, which primarily impacts racialized people.
Let's talk about migrant workers, especially those employed on farms. We've been hearing about a number of deaths during the coronavirus. How have they fared under Doug Ford's government over the last 4 years?
I mean, COVID is a human rights catastrophe, right? So we've lost so many people, at least 3 people from COVID, another 6 during quarantine. And these are, people with families who effectively died, sometimes not being even able to say goodbye to their families back home. They didn't have access to phones. In some cases, for example, Romario Morgan, by the time his body arrived back in Jamaica, it was so decomposed that his own mother was not allowed to look at him. Other people who've passed away and not really been able to get any support from the government. So, thousands of people on farms, thousands of migrants, racialized working class people fell sick, were infected. And the first thing that Doug Ford did is he blamed farm workers. He said that the problem was that they were not getting tested. Then he blamed undocumented farm workers, saying actually the employers are doing everything they can, but these aren't actually the migrant workers in the program. These are other undocumented people who are bringing sickness onto the farms. Then they try to force undocumented farm workers who are asymptomatic to keep working. And each of these moments we were able to organize and push back, and there was some, backstepping from the government in the light of migrant self-organizing. But it has just continued. So, for example, first there was no access to vaccines for migrants, and when vaccine access was available, it was being coerced, right? So workers were, in some cases, being brought out onto farms and just being told to get in line and just being, just injections being pumped into their arms and not knowing what had happened, what they were getting, why. And so we've simultaneously had to push for access, particularly in rural communities where employers are not willing to drive workers to farms, or healthcare services aren't going on the farm for people to have vaccines, and others were being coerced. But at the same time, migrants were able to organize, and in Ontario, it's one of the only provinces that more healthcare is available for undocumented people than anywhere else in the country. So while Ford and his, corporate interests and his entire government has not supported or defended or protected, but in fact blamed and criminalized migrants. Migrant organizing has continued in this moment to be able to get changes.
Hussan, you mentioned a little bit the pushback from movements. If the Conservatives, as the polls indicate, win another 4-year majority, what do you expect from them, and what do you think resistance to their agenda should look like?
I think the reality is that Ford was not able to implement his entire agenda because of COVID-19, and he was forced to be more pro-people than he wanted to be. But I think that in this turn away, when COVID is over, whatever that means, there is going to be a return of the agenda. And I think part of that agenda is going to be cuts to public services. It's going to be austerity because the government is in deficit and they're going to try to cut and cut and cut. And they've already indicated as much. We can see that this massive handouts to real estate developers, this construction of these highways through environmentally protected areas or environmentally needing to be protected areas is all coming to a head, where the actual agenda that he came to in power in 2018, he's going to really try to implement in 2022. And so I think it's about identifying particular sites of struggle, right? So, for example, we can see that there are fights that are coming up in long-term care. There are fights that are coming up around environmental issues. There's going to be fights around the Ring of Fire. We're going to see these issues around like further attacks on working conditions, which he was only able to roll back the Liberals. Now they're going to bring in their own laws, right? So I think we are not very ready. So I think our fight back has to be very, very quickly try to to build some power, and then identify key sites of struggle where campaigns can be made to defend communities. And I think that is going to require a level of coordination between the various sections of the labor movement, which includes non-unionized workers like ours, but also environmental movements, police violence movements. And I'm not so sure that will happen strategically. I hope that it will happen because we will be forced to do so because of the conditions that are presented to us. I think it's important to note that after 2018, when Ford was won, the time it took for the fight back to really get ready, there were some flashpoints, right? The city of Toronto rezoning of the municipal seats, for example. And that fight and that institutional capacity of this building has been lost and has to be regained. So I think a sober analysis is one that leaves one with a lot of work ahead of us.
Well, Hussan, I will leave it at that. Thanks. Maybe not the most optimistic assessment, but
I'm sorry.
But definitely a lucid one. Definitely a lucid one. So thanks so much for speaking to us today.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, lucid, but very sobering. That was Syed Hussan of the Migrant Workers Alliance for Change. We've got a live guest now. Riley Yesno is joining us from Toronto. She's an Anishinaabe scholar and writer and a research fellow with the Yellowhead Institute, which is a First Nation-led think tank at Toronto Metropolitan University. Hi, Riley. Welcome to the program. Welcome back to the show.
Yes. Hello. Nice to see another election round.
Yeah, it's great to have you. So here we are now talking about the Ontario election this time. I want to start by asking you about the Ring of Fire, which has been coming up a lot in this election cycle. Just a brief primer for people in our audience who may be unfamiliar. The Ring of Fire is a region about 500 kilometers northeast of Thunderbay. It's in Treaty 9 territory and home to many Indigenous communities, and the area is set to be very rich in critical minerals. So naturally, mining companies have had their eyes set on the region for a while, and so has Doug Ford. He says he can use the region to make Ontario the #1 leader in North America on electric vehicles and battery manufacturing. I know that you're a member of Upmintang First Nation, which is impacted by these developments. So I wanted to ask you, what do you make of Doug Ford's approach to the Ring of Fire?
Yeah, I think perhaps what is most upsetting about Doug Ford's approach is that he is not an outlier in terms of that statement and that positionality. Every single party, the Greens, the NDP, have all promised to mine in the Ring of Fire. The only difference being that, say, the NDP and the Green have stressed a little bit more like, oh, this is going to be very important about relationships and it's going to be benefit sharing. And like those points are emphasized more than, say, Ford has, but the end is the same. Everybody wants to get a bulldozer in the north. And I think that promise to the electorate comes at the cost of a very real threat to First Nations in the north.
Yeah, I mean, there was, I believe, I forget which ministry it was, federal ministry that actually admitted that the Ring of Fire is a really important carbon sink. It's one of the oldest still intact forests that we have, and it's home to lots of at-risk species. So leaving aside the risks that it poses to the communities who live there, the landscape itself is at threat too, right?
Oh, certainly. Yeah. So it is the largest carbon sink in Ontario and one of the largest in all of Canada. It is, pretty much untouched, which is very, very rare, actually. For most mineral-rich parts of Canada. And it is, the home to some of the greatest biodiversity in the country as well, just south of the tree line before we get up to, the Arctic area. So, yeah, there's a lot at stake there.
And Ford is promising $1 billion to spend $1 billion to build an access road. Like you said, all the parties are promising to build access roads. Ford is saying, I'll do it even if I have to jump on a bulldozer myself. And what's really cynical about all this is the way the greenwashing that's going on too, which is like, oh, we're doing all of this for the sake of electric vehicles and as part of like, emission reductions programs, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's really concerning to me that for all the parties, but certainly the Conservatives, that without, the Ring of Fire is a keystone almost in their climate plans, generally speaking, because of that electrification potential they always tout. And so if they don't have the Ring of Fire, we see how quickly their larger climate plans completely fall apart, that they actually can't meet any of their climate objectives that they speak of. And so this, is often talked about as like a First Nations issue or a Northern Ontario issue, but it should be of concern to any person in Ontario who cares about climate action in this election.
Yeah. Switching gears a bit, a while back in March, Ford was asked about vaccine access in Indigenous communities, and he said, quote, "The Indigenous community has never been treated better, ever." What's your assessment of his track record when it comes to addressing the spread of COVID in Indigenous communities?
Yeah, that's big talk. I think probably what is most symbolically telling about that is that, minutes after he really tried to scapegoat Indigenous MPP Salma Makwa of Kiwetanuk, saying that he was line jumping for getting vaccinated in a community, trying to promote vaccine uptake. And so it just shows how out of touch he is on the ground in the communities. And remain so. And so, we know that Indigenous people not only got blasted, especially into the second and third waves of COVID, but that then, the healthcare infrastructure that was offered to us was really insufficient as well. And so then that's when you saw the numbers rising in big hub cities like Thunderbay. And so all around, there is no basis of fact for that statement. And it's really, really untruthful and harmful.
Yeah, and when he said that the NDP MPP Salma Makwa was jumping queue, he was actually getting a vaccine as part of a program for addressing vaccine hesitancy, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the language that he used, I thought was always so interesting. I wrote about where he said, he was not a member of that community, but from maybe on the banned council list, but shows also his ignorance about Indigenous kinship systems and how we get to say who community is, and how there's fluid systems up in the north that, isn't separated by like these rigid reserve boundaries that he'd like to make it out to be in order to, really villainize him in this instance. And so, yeah, it was really ignorant on a lot of fronts.
Back in December, the Auditor General in Ontario, and I think you wrote about this as well, found that the Ontario government has no coordinated approach when it comes to delivering Indigenous programs and services. It's all over the map. The different departments don't even really speak to each other. What do you think 4 more years of Ford would mean then for Indigenous communities?
Yeah, I mean, I think the last 4 years have been really, really tough for Indigenous communities. Like, one of the first things I remember Doug Ford did when he got into office was scrap the Indigenous education curriculum, and then the Indigenous Culture Fund, amalgamated Indigenous services with natural resources, making it abundantly clear where he sees Indigenous people value and where he does as valuable and where he does not. And so Indigenous people have had a lot of fights. And so I only see, perhaps in the same tune as the past guest, very soberingly, that it's a little hard looking 4 years. But I also think that this will be an essential point to really hold on to where we've seen really great solidarity from folks in filling those gaps that the Ford government has ripped open. In the past 4 years, I have been to, I think, 17 different school boards in Ontario with teachers who just said, obviously we're not getting any provincial help for this now, but I'm spending my own time, sometimes my own money, to bring in Indigenous people for our students, for example, as a way that people are bridging those gaps on the ground. And so we have now some basis of organizing. And so I hope that that's something that we really remember, even as, as demoralizing as perhaps a loss could be.
We're just 3 minutes now away from polls closing. The results are going to start streaming in very soon after that. Is there anything in specific you're watching tonight? Or are there any particular ridings, MPPs you're following closely?
Yeah, so I'm really hoping, I'm always paying attention to the North. And so I'm in my riding, I'm an NDP riding. We're hoping for a re-election here in Spadina, Fort York. But in Northern Ontario, Thunderbay, that has been a long time Liberal stronghold. It was actually considered to be the one that was going to save the Liberals from not losing party status in the last election, and then that fell through. And so I'm waiting to see if we're going to be able to keep those orange ridings, as well as, a longtime favorite, Michael Gravel in Thunderbay, Rainy River, step down. And so it leaves a really good opening for candidate Lise Bourgeois. And yeah, I'll be hoping to see how that top half of the map looks.
Yeah, well, we'll be watching with you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
It's great to have you. Riley Yesno is an Anishinaabe scholar and writer. She was in Toronto. I want to bring Martin back in now. What have you been watching while this is happening? Are there particular writings you're watching closely?
Yeah, I'm definitely paying attention to downtown Toronto, where in the last election, a number of NDP MPPs picked up seats, many of them really stalwart progressive MPPs. And I am wondering if in some of those ridings, whereas they were helped by the kind of Liberal collapse of the votes in 2018, we might see the Liberal bounce back this time, unseat a few people. So I'm watching Jessica Bell in University of Rosedale, an incredible longtime activist. It's a very close riding. I'm watching Jill Andrews riding in St. Paul's. There's also Merritt Stiles in Butilla, Carpatch. There is also a bit further afield in Ottawa, Joel Harden's riding, who may be one of the hardest working MPPs, a socialist, and who was a real standout during the occupation in Ottawa, out on the streets with people. So I'm curious what's going to happen there. I'm also watching Southwest Ontario, where the Tories are gunning for a number of NDP seats, including in places like Hamilton, Brampton, Oshawa, London. The kind of late stage conversion, quite cynical, but late stage conversion of Doug Ford to electric vehicle production, mostly as a vote buying maneuver, could pay off there and peel off a lot of working class votes that traditionally go NDP. So I'm going to keep my eyes on that, because that too could really cement a significant majority for the Tories if they can win those seats.
Yeah. Well, it's 9 o'clock, so as you can see, our ticker is now at the bottom of the screen, so we'll be updating that regularly, and you can follow who is leading and who is winning in all of the different parties. Martin, I'm going to say bye to you real quick and bring in our next live guest. Our next guest is Nigel Bariffe. He's a teacher and the executive officer at Elementary Teachers of Toronto. Sorry, Nigel. He's also the chair of the Urban Alliance on Race Relations. Hi, I'm so glad you could join us.
Good to see you. How are you? Sorry,
You're moving.
I'm moving. I'm totally. The lighting in here was terrible, so it wasn't what they told me. Michael made me test it first, and then I.
These are all the joys of going live.
It's still terrible.
It's okay. We can hear you, and that's all that matters. So if you're settled and ready, Nigel, I have to start by asking you about the clusterfuck. And yes, it was a clusterfuck around school closures and online learning during the pandemic. Ontario closed more schools than any other jurisdiction in North America. And I have a friend who's a parent who loves crunching numbers, and he told me that there were 36 weeks where schools were closed during the pandemic in Ontario. And according to his calculations, that's more than double any other province. And so, all the teachers and parents that I know have just been at their wits' end over the last 2 years. So I want to ask you, what happened? Was this just plain inaptitude by the Ford government, or was there something more sinister going on?
Well, I mean, look, the public school system here in Ontario has been defunded for the past 2 decades. I mean, we know that it started under Mike Harris. The defunding continued under consecutive Liberal governments. And then it's been personified by this current government, the really misogynistic contempt he seems to have for elementary school teachers, right? So when you've been defunding that much, we're $6 billion in the hole in fixing buildings. So of course, when you have an airborne virus, then it just exposed everything that was going on within the school system. And I gotta give a big shout out to my fellow school teachers and all of the education workers that, in spite of the incompetence of this current government, they still made sure that the schools worked. I've got a 6-year-old son, Joshua. He loves school. He loves his teachers, and they found a way to make him love school in spite of everything. He doesn't really realize that school isn't pandemic. What learning online isn't normal, right?
Yeah.
But
it's all he knows now.
Yeah. So we know that we had the buildings that need to be fixed. We had large class sizes, right? And then we had this push for the privatization of the hybrid learning that was just so problematic.
Yeah. And like you say, all of that, the privatization, the moving learning to online, that's all been on Ford's agenda since before the pandemic. And I guess they didn't want to let a good crisis go to waste, huh?
Yeah, and I mean, I think Naomi Klein has written about this, and we know that much research about disaster capitalism, and certainly this would be a perfect example of it, of them using this excuse of the pandemic to bring in things like online learning, right? So now, if you're in high school, you have to take 2 online courses to get your degree. Right. And the only way to opt out of it is if your parents sign a letter saying that you opt out of it. And the reason why that's so important for all of us to take in is because it means that the school boards have to pay private consultants. So we're taking public money to pay private consultants to deliver those online courses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, during the pandemic, the other thing that caught a lot of people's attention, just going back to the mishandling in schools, there was that explosive report in the Star that outlined how Doug Ford's government gave tens of thousands of free rapid tests to private schools, right when his government was advising public schools against even using those tests and saying they don't need it.
You're making my blood boil. I mean, we had, so the incompetence was him removing things like masking, right? All of a sudden. And so teachers were getting sick. Education workers were getting sick. They were catching COVID, so they couldn't go in. Meanwhile, they couldn't get rapid tests nowhere around. And then to find that private schools received these for free that were paid by the public. Yeah, let me tell you, it was it didn't land very well on many of the teachers and the education workers and parents, right? So it was just horrible. And again, the contempt this government has for public education.
But here's my question. So there was so much outrage. I mean, I don't know a single parent with a, child of school age who wasn't outraged during this pandemic in Ontario. And yet, we are expecting another win, probably, barring any major surprises for the Doug Ford Conservatives. Yeah. Why the NDP in particular, why hasn't it been more successful or more militant in harnessing that anger, that angst that came about during the pandemic?
Well, I think, Hussan has already kind of spoken to the importance of us being prepared for this next iteration of this government. It is so disappointing that the NDP was not able to harness the anger over the past 4 years. I think there were many grassroots movements that should have had more. That should have been, the arm should have been wrapped around those movements. I think, Labor has to have its own reckoning in this also. Mm-hmm. That why aren't we supporting the grassroots community movements? I think of, even like the housing issue and we should have all been, as workers, as working class people, we should have been in the parks to say, hey, these people need a place to live, right? There were many moments throughout the last 4 years where the movements, the grassroots movements, and the political infrastructure, the opposition parties, and Labor should have come together. And that's the reckoning, I think, that as we move forward, as we look at how we're going to resist the onslaught of austerity that's going to be coming at us if the polls play out the way that they've been predicted, then we have to do a better job of having an intersection approach, of bringing together all of our movements, the environmental movement, education, housing, healthcare, that we have to come together and build our power together to fight against this next government.
Yeah. Just on a bit of a different topic, but while we still have a few minutes left together, I want to also ask you as an educator about what we've seen under Ford and in this election cycle in general around anti-Black racism and violence in schools. Press Progress broke that story, awful story last month, that Stephen Lecce, the person in charge of our education system in the province, participated in a slave auction when he was a frat leader in his student days at Western. He's apologized since the story came out, but he refuses to step down. What was your reaction when you heard that story?
I mean, this is an example of white privilege, how it plays out. Any other politician, this would have crushed, right? It would have ended their career. But he gets to continue. It's a frat boy, privileged, that it's just, it was just disgusting, right? And it was so hurtful, but it was not surprising. And again, I think it's just why in the school systems, right? We have a problem with anti-Black racism, with anti-Semitism, with Islamophobia, but we're not seeing the kind of funding within education. Again, it comes back to where are our priorities? So we're not doing the funding to give, for instance, the educators the training, the resources to help the students to deal with it. I'm a board member of the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, and we put together a number of educational materials that we've been trying to talk to the Toronto District School Board and the many school boards around the province about bringing into to the schools to help identify youth, children that are going down the rabbit hole. So there are solutions to deal with this, but certainly it starts by, we can't have this frat boy who's been leading the province public education. It's absolutely disgusting.
You're getting a call there, or some sort of announcement. We are just minutes away from getting results. If we get 4 more years of Ford, Nigel, what can we expect from educators in the province, do you think?
Look, I'm the incoming vice president of the Elementary Teachers of Toronto. Our new president, Helen Victorous, is a powerful sister from the LGBTQ activist that has an intersectional approach. I know that she and our team at the Elementary Teachers are the fourth largest in the North America, largest teacher local in the country. We know that we have to take an intersectional approach, that we have to be fighting for the common good. We have to wrap our hands around our nurses, around other public sector workers, around our housing activists, around our immigration issues, and that we have to fight together against this government. Because what we're going to see is an onslaught of austerity, using the excuse that we have to pay our bills. But instead, what we're going to see is Doug Ford's Bay Street buddies line their pockets with more and more of our public funds. So we're school teachers will be ready, and education workers will be ready for this fight, and we're going to stand shoulder to shoulder with community and all the other organizations to fight against this government.
Nigel, thanks for your time. It was really great of you to join us.
I'm so honored and humbled. Thank you. Bye, Joshua. Bye, Anna. Love you.
Bye. That was Nigel Bariffe, a teacher and organizer in Toronto. You're watching The Breach Show. This is our live election special, Ontario 2022. If you want to support the work that we do, please consider becoming a paying member. You can go to breachmedia.ca and get all the information you need. Time for another check-in with our panel. I hope Pam is also on standby. We'll bring her in when she's there.
Yep.
There you are.
I'm good. The morning lasts for hours, so you don't need to ask me twice.
So, Pam, we're watching the results come in. It's going to be a little bit longer until we get full confirmation, but I want to ask you, if we're stuck with 4 more years of Ford, what's that going to mean for Indigenous communities in Ontario?
Oh my goodness. Well, where do I start? First of all, the Ford government didn't actually have a platform. They had a budget that was introduced but never voted on or debated, and that was kind of like the de facto platform. But when you look at all of the documents or announcements that he's made, I mean, even in his budget, there was 2 small paragraphs about Indigenous peoples. It was all about building highways and the Ring of Fire, and unlocking the minerals in Ontario. So we know it's going to be fast forward on construction of highways, destruction of the environment. We know it's going to be fast forward on extraction, probably energy development, and he will literally run roughshod over First Nation rights. And it's not even like he's made that a secret. He's literally said, if I have to jump on the bulldozer, I'll do it. And so we know where he's going with that. But like on another front, you have to think about all of the other issues, that First Nations face in the province, like systemic racism, some of the things that Nigel was talking about. Well, think about all of the, police shootings of Indigenous peoples, the, racial profiling, the brutality, the higher rates of incarceration, all of that happening in Ontario, the high rates of First Nations kids in care, murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. And the majority of this stuff happens off reserve. So in Ontario's cities and towns, and you don't see Doug Ford even mentioning that. I mean, his only concern really is our resources.
Yeah. Yeah, whose resources exactly?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that anecdote about him claiming that Indigenous people have never been better off moments before accusing Salma Makwa of jumping the queue is just, it tells you everything you need to know.
Yeah, exactly. Or referring to like unarmed, peaceful land defenders and water protectors in Ontario as rogues or militants or criminals, or, you know what I mean? Like really trying to isolate them from their own people and portraying us, as always, in a very racist and stereotypical way. I mean, he literally proves the point about the bad relationships here in Ontario.
Yeah. Martin, what have you got your eyes on while we wait?
Well, I've been struck by early reports that the voter turnout is extremely low. Possibly, pardon me?
What kind of numbers are we looking at?
Anywhere as low. It was earlier today. It was at 30%, and the reports were that by 9 p.m. We'd have perhaps 50%, but earlier today it was something like 30. So. Perhaps it's not a total surprise when, you know, you've seen over the last 30 years just this convergence of, you know, programs and politics amongst the parties, a kind of basic consensus about really fundamental political questions, and no one offering anything that would really excite people to come out and vote. So that's something that we'll see where that lands, you know, by the end of tonight. I'm struck too. You're seeing some of the vote count come in. Our ticker is a little bit behind where others are. The PCs are obviously out to a very strong start. I think they're actually closer to 53 seats at this moment, and the NDP is clocking in at 20. The Liberals at 8 so far, and the Greens have their 1. But, you know, we're still quite early in terms of the ballots counted. So, but again, 63 seats for a majority.
That's all we need.
And it looks like they might reach that in short order.
Pam, what do you think is the impact of the low turnout that we're looking at?
Well, I think you really have to look at the trends. So, you know, you've got like in the 70s and 80s, voter turnouts like, you know, mid 60s, and that was pretty much staying there. But then, you know, you move on and, you know, throughout the years, and then it goes down to, you know, in the 1990s, in the 50s, but the high 50s. And then in the 2000s, it like really just takes a dive. And it was starting to come back up again in the last 2 elections. But, you know, like Martin was saying, the predictions are anywhere between like 35, maybe 45% turnout. So here's the thing. I know I've heard from lots of people that what's the point of voting? It's a done deal. We already know he's going to get a majority election. Okay, and that's one way of looking at it, and that might, you know, for some people turn them off from voting altogether. But there's another side to that. Well, imagine if we were able to rally 20, 30%, even 40%. I mean, imagine if we had a historic voting that was more progressive, and even if it was strategic or not strategic, but the people who don't want Ford to come in, who are disillusioned, to actually go out there and try to vote him out. I mean, maybe we would be successful, but certainly with low voting numbers like this, that would be hard to do.
Yeah, and this is something I know I'm going to get into when I talk to Judy Rebick shortly, but it's been such an uninspiring campaign. I mean, wow. There are a lot of people I spoke to who are just like, yeah, okay, I guess I'll go vote as kind of out of a sense of duty or obligation or harm reduction, like you called it before, but not because they're actually inspired by anything that they're seeing.
No, exactly. I mean, at least the first time around, he was, you know, praising Buck a beer. We had things to laugh at. But I mean, this election is just, he's made sure his folks are trying not to show up at debates, not speaking to media, not allowing certain media to be accredited. I mean, it's really, really silent. And then, you know, disappointingly, the NDP haven't been loud and out there about what they have to offer and what it means. And I mean, I'm not surprised the Liberals have just been quiet all the way along, so they've just failed miserably in this election. But I mean, come on, like act like it's an election. At least act like it's somewhat exciting and that there's a possibility for change, and inspire people to go out and vote. And instead of just, it's like nothing's happening.
Yeah, and it's been interesting to see how Ford's kind of essentially defensive strategy has really paid off for him. The strategy of him, pretending that he had changed and moderated himself and adopting a kind of, renewed pro-worker shtick with a whole suite of policies that at their surface looked actually quite progressive and in the interests of workers. And once you start kind of peeling away the layers, you realize that in fact, whether it's their policies on temp workers or the minimum wage or the supposed paid sick days, all of those were either an attempt to preempt any more significant progressive changes or really just window dressing. And I think it, unfortunately, with the kind of uncritical treatment that he's gotten in much of the media, which, in Ontario mostly operates in a right-wing echo chamber, apart from the Toronto Star, though we're starting to see some shifts from them as well, has meant that he has got an easier ride to a re-election than we might have imagined.
Well, I've got some news. CBC is now projecting that Doug Ford's Progressive Conservatives have won a majority government. So, in case anyone's surprised...
Not surprised, he's already at 60 seats.
Yes,
right?
he is.
So he's got 60 seats. Come on.
He does. He has 60 seats. Our ticker will be updated shortly to reflect that as well. But I'll read you the numbers that I see right now. The Conservatives have 60. The NDP have 24. And the Liberals have 8. The Greens have 1. And the Independents. And there's 1 Independent as well.
And it looks like they'll be gaining more seats as well.
Yeah. More are projected. Yes.
I wonder if this is a record for earliest majority called. Pretty quick, 20 minutes. For those of us who pay more attention to federal elections, usually the agony takes a bit longer. This is a bit like ripping off a Band-Aid.
Well, it's not totally done until those other small number of polling stations actually close. Because keep in mind, there's that list of polling stations that are going for the next 2 hours so that the people that are in line can actually finish voting. So those final numbers won't actually be in for another couple of hours.
That's right. And it's notable so far, again, these are not final. So far, the NDP have lost 6 seats, and the Conservatives have gained 3, and the Liberals have gained 2. So that's likely to fluctuate, I think, as we get more results. But early results seem to indicate that the NDP are losing seats. Yeah.
That wouldn't be a total disaster from the perspective, I think, of the party. The NDP, I think they were probably quietly banking on greater losses than that. I wonder to what extent that will mean that they won't fundamentally question their approach, which I think they really need to, because I think electoral seats alone are not the metric by which we should assess success for the party.
Yeah. They are at risk of losing their opposition status, though, are they not?
No. I think they're significantly ahead of the Liberals right now, who I imagine would have hoped to do much better. Certainly displace the NDP as official opposition. I think that was, like, to a large degree their strategy in this election. I think they didn't have any hope of winning office, winning government, but I think they were. If you saw from the last few days, Del Duca was. In his last days of campaigning, targeting NDP ridings. So that, which is usually a good tell for, what the party is aiming for. So they were hoping to displace several NDP candidates. And so far, it looks like they may not achieve that, which is, I think, a silver lining of this election so far.
That's right.
There's no silver lining in this election. What are you talking about?
I know,
Martin?
You're a full-on mourner, but even mourners need to find a silver lining.
The PCs are now at 66 seats. How do you stop this runaway train? I don't even get a buck of beer out of this deal.
It's true.
Well, some of the candidates we've been watching, we can give you some updates. Joel Harden, the New Democrat in Ottawa Centre, did win his seat with 53% of the share of the votes.
That's great news.
We'll keep updating you on those races. There's some where it's still very close. In Oshawa, the NDP and Niagara Centre, the NDP are in the lead, but it's extremely close. It's a very small margin. So that's likely going to fluctuate as well. Right now, we're at 66 seats for the Conservatives.
Exactly. And the Liberals have jumped up one. They're 9. NDP are 24. They jumped up one. I'm waiting to see if Greens get there too. I mean, literally double. I mean, wouldn't that say something? That kind of reminds me of the federal Greens when they had 1 and then they doubled to 2. And it was just like such a big deal. But anyway, we'll see.
We'll see.
So far, Mike Schreiner has handily re-won his seat in Guelph, almost by double the vote of the Conservatives. Oh, wow. I know that they're definitely gunning for one in the middle area of Ontario near Georgian Bay, where they've been putting a lot of their resources and energy. So we'll see if they can pull off that second seat and get that stronger foothold in legislature.
Yeah. Well, we'll close up our panel here for now, and we'll reconvene again at least one more time before the end of the evening. Bye, Pam. And Martin, I'll come back to you in a little bit, maybe with some more updates about writings. But right now, I want to bring in our next guest, Judy Rebick. She's joining us live from Toronto. She is a journalist, political activist, and most recently the author of the book, Heroes in My Head. Hi, Judy.
Hi. Actually, I'm in Montreal.
Oh, you're in Montreal. My bad.
But not in your studio.
Yeah. Well, next time we'll make sure to have you in studio. Welcome back to the Breach Show and your second election special with us.
Is it?
Well, we did the federal one with you as well.
I forgot. I have a terrible memory.
So, Judy, I want to cut right to it. Okay, so seeing the results the NDP is getting, the new majority for the progressive governments, is it time for Andrea Horwath to step down as leader?
Yes, I think it was time a long time ago. But I was part of a group that criticized her in the election against Kathleen Wynne 2 elections ago because they ran such a right-wing campaign. This time they're running, their policies are great, actually, quite strong on many things, not on the environment as much as some other things. But she just can't relate to people. She can't connect with people. She's a terrible leader. And she has been from the beginning. And I do not know why. I have talked to many NDPers about it, and nobody can tell me why she's still there. But if she's still there after this, it's ridiculous. I mean, although they do look like they're going to do better than the media said they were going to do. So early on. But,
we were just saying there was a lot of fear or there was the suggestion that they would lose their opposition status, but that's not happening. Yeah.
Well, not yet.
Not yet, anyway. It's just so perplexing.
The early results tend to be from the city of Toronto, and that's where that's where the polls say they're the best. In the city.
That's true.
Not even in the GTA, but in the city of Toronto, and usually that's where early polls are coming from. So it could shift, but right now the way it looks is that it's going to be a very similar parliament legislature as it is now. Yeah, that's what it's like.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you would think that after 4 years of misery under Ford, 2 years of it during a pandemic that he clearly mishandled, there was the botched school closures, which we already talked about. There was all the unnecessary deaths in long-term care homes. You would have thought the NDP would be able to galvanize the anti-Ford vote, and yet here we are.
Yeah. Well, I think they should have been, but on the other hand, COVID's changed a lot of things. People are more conservative, I think. I don't want to see change or afraid, and Ford, for all his problems at the beginning, he surprised everybody, including even me, with how well he was doing at the beginning COVID. He took it seriously. He went up against the anti-vaxxers in a clear way that, let's say, Jason Kenney didn't do. He kicked people out of caucus who refused to get vaccinated. So, he was surprising at the beginning, and I think that he made an impression. And now the media coverage has been so biased in this election. I've been, as you know, I've written about it. I've been quite shocked by how biased the media coverage has been. Both from the very beginning, they posed it as a fight between the Liberals and the Conservatives, even though the NDP was the official opposition, and the Liberals only had 7 seats. And the Liberals campaigned on so-called strategic voting, which meant to vote for them, which is nonsense. The strategic vote in this election would be for the NDP, not for the Liberals. I don't believe in strategic voting, but I'm just saying that the media coverage has been terrible, but it doesn't look like it's done the Liberals very much good. So.
And the thing that the media has talked a lot about, it's something pundits have made a lot of, is just how Doug Ford has shown this ability to change, to shift, and that this may have been attractive to some voters. He didn't oppose Trudeau's pandemic policies like some other Conservative premiers did. He didn't explicitly side with the convoy in Ottawa. He's just the guy who, quote, gets it done. Do you think that actually played into his success? How much of a role did it have?
I totally think it did. I think it did because he expresses his feelings. He talks about that he made mistakes, right? Andrea Horwath never admits to making mistakes, So I think that there's a humanness about him. Like, I don't think there was when he first ran. I don't know how he ever got elected last time, but this time he's learned a little more how to connect. And he's especially good at connecting one-on-one, from what I can see. And so I think that's
shaking hands.
And also, they've run a very careful campaign. They're keeping him away from media. They're keeping it. The only thing he's been doing is shaking people's hands and smiling at them, and that's the only thing he's good at. So, so I think they ran a very careful campaign. And the NDP ran a terrible campaign, even though they had a great platform. They didn't come out fighting. They didn't stand up strong enough against the Conservatives. They didn't even strongly point out the terrible things the Conservatives done. For example, all the deaths in long-term care and the fact that they gave the long-term care homes money, so much money, and when they had given all the money to their stockholders instead of to care for patients. And the media just didn't cover it properly. And the Conservatives have run a very cautious campaign. And the opposition hasn't taken advantage. I mean, in the debate, the only one who landed any blows against Ford was the Green Party leader.
That's right. Yeah. But this is what's perplexing. I mean, maybe it's not perplexing, but this is supposed to be the most left-wing NDP platform we've seen in decades, some would say. And yet it doesn't inspire hope. It doesn't inspire confidence. It doesn't inspire people to go to the polls and vote for the NDP despite all of what we've seen under Ford. I mean, what does that tell you about the state of electoral politics in Ontario and the power of the left in particular to inspire hope and signal the possibility of change?
I haven't seen the left this week ever in my lifetime. And it's not just in Canada, it's global. I mean, with the exception of some Latin American countries and I think Darfur, although I'm not sure about Darfur. So this is the weakest I think the left has been. The left, as you know, we wrote about the fact that the left is absent during COVID.
That's right.
With the exception of the medical doctors who have organized and nurses, the unions have been almost absent. Like if you remember against the Ford government when there were cutbacks in education, the Elementary Teachers Federation went out on an illegal strike against
Mike Harris.
Against Mike Harris, right?
Yeah.
And now, with all the terrible things that happened during COVID in the schools, where's the Elementary Teachers Federation? Not out on strike, that's for sure, not strongly organized either. I mean, the teachers did do some work. I'm not saying they didn't. So there hasn't been any inspiration from the left, not just the NDP, but anywhere.
Organized labor, yeah.
Organized labor has come out, it's definitely organized during the election. There's no doubt about that. And maybe that's one reason why the NDP is doing as well as they are doing. The OFL did lead a good campaign during the election, but previous to that, they were almost invisible. And so it's very, I find it very depressing. And I'm one who always looks for the light,
Yeah. It's
and
been.
I don't see much. I really don't. I mean, there's some positive things happening at a federal level, but at the provincial level, not much positive happening, and it's very disconcerting. And people aren't going out to vote because they're not inspired. There's been very little. I heard you mention Joel Duff. Why is Joel Duff one immediately when he's riding? It's because he was out.
Yeah. Other Joel. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
Because he was out there during the convoy organizing people to fight back, right? And very visibly doing so.
He's very active in his community.
Yeah, and there's a lot of great local candidates, local NDP candidates. But these days, it's, I ran for the NDP back in the 90s, right? And at that time, you could get attention as a local candidate. I mean, the Globe and Mail wrote an article about us doing a women's canvass, right? You can't get that kind of attention at the local level anymore, so it's hard. It's hard to motivate people if it's not happening at the provincial level. It's hard to motivate people to vote at the riding level. And also, we don't have a youth uprising like we have had in other times of change, right?
Yeah. But you've been through.
COVID and schools aren't in, right? I mean, universities. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say you've been politically active during multi-term Conservative governments in Ontario. What do you think the fight back against Ford should look like now, or could?
Well, the first danger is privatization of care, privatization of health care, privatization of long-term care, and privatization of childcare. Because in the childcare, this didn't get any attention at all. But the negotiated deal on childcare that Ford made pushed the federal government to increase the number of private childcare centers.
Yeah.
Okay. So instead of freezing it at 25, went up to 35, and that's what he's going to push, and that's what he's pushing everywhere: is privatization of care, privatization of all kinds of care, and particularly in health care. He's talking about private hospitals. Now, I know in Quebec you can get private surgery. You can't get that in Ontario. Like, we have a strong public system, and that's going to be a big fight. And fortunately, the Ontario Health Coalition has been very well organized on that.
Yes.
So I'm hoping, but I was hoping people would be more motivated to vote based on that as well, and they haven't been. And so I think that's going to be very key. The thing about Ford is he's not an ideologue. He's no Pierre Poilievre, right? You're not worried about social conservatives taking control of the party in Ontario, although they will do everything they can to restrict access to abortion, because that's what they always do. But I am worried about privatization. I think that's going to be the big fight. And I don't know if there's an ability to mobilize against it. I really don't know. Like, I think the experience of COVID and especially university students being out of school for two years, and people not being at work. And, if I think of how I radicalized, social connection was a big part of that, right? When I was at university, why did I become a radical? It's because the people who were radicals were the people I liked, the people I connected to, the people that were most like me. And you do that on social media, but it becomes much more distorted. And it's much less, much less deep, if you want. Yeah. Much more shallow connection. So,
let's hope that some of those social connections and organizing starts happening outside the ballot box in the weeks and months ahead.
Well,
back the Ford agenda.
We don't have the experience of the Americans of. I think occasionally we've done it, but not very often. To have social movements organizing in a big way during an election. Now, in this election, there were movements organizing for anybody but Ford. and
Yeah.
obviously it didn't work.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, Judy, thank you so much for joining and sharing your thoughts tonight, even though it's a bit of a depressing night and a lot of sobering analysis to go around.
Yeah.
Hope to talk to you soon. That was Judy Rebick, a journalist and political activist in Toronto. Martin, what did we miss while we were chatting?
Well, more silver linings, perhaps. Stephen Del Duca looks like he might be losing his own seat, which would be a pretty devastating blow to the Liberals. We're also seeing a lot of those NDP progressive candidates that we were watching in downtown Toronto, also confirming that they're winning by wide margins. People like Merritt Stiles and Butila Karpach, of margins of like winning by 50% of the vote, which is really exciting to see. So it's, NDP staying strong in downtown Toronto.
Yeah. What were your impressions as you were listening to Judy there? I mean, this idea that I just said that the as someone who's been through so many years of struggle and fight back, to hear the kind of the deep sadness in her voice and kind of loss of hope it's hard to reckon with.
Well, I never thought I would potentially be more optimistic than Judy Rebick, who's famed for keeping the spirit up. I would disagree reluctantly, because Judy's a friend and a mentor, but I think there's a lot of reasons to be hopeful about the state of the left. It's true that I think organizationally speaking, the left has is quite weak these days, but in terms of the political discourse and popular support for radical ideas, that is incredibly strong and growing stronger, whether you're talking about support in Canada for policies like a Green New Deal or defunding the police, or taxing the wealthy. All those ideas, which don't really find much expression among the political parties, do have huge support among the population. So I think what the paradox that we are struggling with is that there's a huge gulf between where we need the left to be in this moment, and where it could be based on just the latent support for ideas that we support, and where we are currently organizationally. And I think that gulf needs to be closed. And I think that is the task for the left, but it's not as hopeless as I think Judy makes it out to be.
I hope you're right. So just a quick update on the numbers that you see on your screen. The Progressive Conservatives are right now holding on to 78, actually just got updated on my screen, 78 seats with about 41% of the share of the votes. The NDP have 27 seats with 24% of the votes. The Liberals have 10 seats with 23%, and the Greens have 1 seat, and there's 1 independent seat as well. We're gonna go to our live guest in a moment, but first I want us to listen to a spoken word piece by Elle Jones, who is no stranger to people who've been watching our show. This is a poem that she wrote called Minimum Wage. As we know, the fight for a higher minimum wage has been a part of this election campaign. And Doug Ford first rolled back the $15 an hour wage, but then he was forced to partially restore it. And movements have been now pushing for a $20 an hour demand, and they succeeded in at least pressuring the NDP to put that demand in their platform. In the spirit of this struggle, we're going to listen to Elle Jones' poem, Minimum Wage.
Maria has 3 kids under school age. In the morning, she wakes them up before daybreak, travels an hour on transit to her mom's because she can't afford a daycare place. She'd like to go back to school, but there's no way. Not when she's choosing between food and the bills to pay. She has to turn to the food bank to keep food on their plates, working all day till her back breaks. Her feet swell in her shoes after hour 8. Her employer makes her work through her mandated breaks, but she can't complain because she's too afraid. If he fires her, how can she keep the rent paid? There's dozens who could take her place, they say. Just look at the unemployment rate. And how can it be when she works all day that they're cutting her power and water again? Hour after hour, and she can't gain. while her employer's enjoying his vacay. The company's registering record profits again. They're not even pretending it trickles down these days. Even the poverty line seems so far away. How can it be this is okay when you can't live a life on the minimum wage? Mohammed came to this country to escape. Hid in the hold of a container ship for 14 days, almost suffocated to death inside a crate. They told him a better life was the Canadian way. All his qualifications at home have just been erased. He'll have to start at the bottom and work his way. He found a job in a restaurant washing plates, saving to bring his family over someday from a refugee camp an ocean away. When he gets close to benefits, somehow his hours get mislaid, but he can't complain because he's too afraid. If he loses his job, maybe he can't stay. Seems like Canada's not quite like it was portrayed. With the struggles he has, he's just dismayed, wondering how all his dreams got misplaced because you can't live a life on the minimum wage. And Kathy works at a certain coffee place. And when the province put up the minimum wage, they told her no more coffee to take away, plus her own uniform she would have to pay. Multi-millions in profits they still take. They made sure that the workers are feeling the ricochet, taking revenge if they disobey. Petty attempts to intimidate because they want us for life on the minimum wage. Michaela's the first in her family to graduate. She's dreamed of being a nurse since the first grade, but it costs so much money to educate. She works nights and then goes to class all day. Almost fell asleep in the last exam she had to take, hour after hour, and she can't game. The government says young people just spend play money on spring break. Why do they need more than the minimum wage? Education or the bills she has to weigh, plus it seems that her future's been mortgaged. Student loans got her in debt for decades. No help for her coming from financial aid. Won't be paid back till her hair's gray. But her bosses, the government serenades, while they treat the workers like renegades. Care for our youth is a masquerade. They can't live a life on the minimum wage. And bills on a construction site hired day by day. Under the table is how he gets paid. Taxes the companies evades. No health care if it's unsafe. Off the books, so if he's injured, they won't compensate. Companies had 3 deaths in a decade. Wasn't even covered in the news, so no outrage. Fined a few thousand each time, so they're unswayed. No reason to care if the cable's frayed. As long as the foundations get laid. As long as the bid had a few thousand shaved. Who cares if a few workers' backs break? Survival of the bills, is that a fair trade? Risking a life on the minimum wage. Donna worked all her life as a maid. There's arthritis in her limbs, her whole body aches. Can't lie down without pain between her shoulder blades. Tens of thousands of beds that her hands made. Down on her knees scrubbing toilets and grates. 70 years old and no upgrade. On minimum wage, she's got no retirement saved. Can't even pay for her pills to medicate. Never any extras to put away, so she still has to go to work every day. Won't get to rest though her hair is gray, while the corporations get tax breaks. Still on her feet after 5 decades, greeting at the door with a tag with her name. No retirement, but her employee feels no shame. And then they tell her her job's being shipped away. She'd like to put her grandchildren through school, but there's no way. Poverty cycle in families that can't break. Life after life stuck on the minimum wage. And we'll all be beat down with our teeth decayed, because our life and well-being's corporations trade, and governments get elected and then betray, promises made that they always break, day after day, and they just degrade, and the government just offering up band-aids, but the quality of living we need to raise. No more labor effectively unpaid, no benefits or pensions is not okay, working for nothing to wear in the grave, life after life that employers waste. We have to rise up, and we can't wait, because we can't live a life on the minimum wage.
That was Elle Jones with the spoken word piece, Minimum Wage.
Bringing the fire.
Yeah.
That was the jolt of energy we needed.
That's right. Even in her physical absence on the panel, we still get to experience her fire. I want to see if Pam is somewhere to be found. There she is. Hi.
I'm here. I'm watching election commentary everywhere on Twitch, on YouTube, on Twitter. It's like multiple screens, checking it out to see if maybe somebody has said, oh, this isn't true. This is all a ruse. Here's the real numbers. But no, not the case.
Pam, I know you're in mourning. You've made that very clear. But I feel like we need a little bit of injection of hope right now. We've been listening to a lot of sobering and somber analysis. And Judy's commentary in particular really stuck with me. I want to hear from you. Are there social movements? Are there, things going on the ground that give you hope?
Yes. Everything that we are doing gives me hope. And here's the thing, nothing in human society ever that's good and transformative and radical and good for us has ever come without long periods of social conflict. People often step away from social conflict. They think it's a bad thing. But in fact, social conflict and resistance and advocacy and standing up for your rights, all of that got us, civil rights in the United States, the end of slavery, women's rights, Indigenous rights, human rights, environmental protections. None of that would have come voluntarily from governments. We know that they're only concerned about their own power, their wealth, the corporate interests. So it's the people, when they rise up and they're the government, and they say what's going to happen. That's what gives me hope. And so far, when I look around, I still see First Nations defending their lands and waters. I see unions protecting workers' rights. I see nurses standing up for themselves, teachers standing up for themselves, kids even standing up for other kids. And so long as there is that, there's boots on the ground, there's people standing up, we got this. And listen, we've survived every prime minister, every premier that there's ever been. They're not here forever. It sucks that he's going to be here another 4 years, kind of like when Stephen Harper got in again, and it was like, oh no, because it means there's so much more work for us to do, and that's like pretty depressing. But that being said, maybe that'll be the inspiration to change everything, kind of like Stephen Harper inspired the I Don't Know More movement, and we were able to just get him out in droves. Well, maybe that'll be the same here, so I'm hopeful.
We're watching also just to let you both know, we're watching to see if there's going to be a victory speech or a concession speech coming up. So if that does happen, we'll have to cut away for that. But just to give you some of the numbers again, we're 80 seats for the Progressive Conservatives. That's so far a gain of 6 seats for the party. And the New Democrats have lost 9 seats since the last election, and they're at 28. The Liberals have gained 2 and they're at 9. Martin, what gives you hope?
I mean, yeah, not just the indigenous struggle in this country, but the way in which I have seen young people across the country open their eyes to the fundamental injustices that underlie this country and the urgent need to resolve them and reset relations with Indigenous peoples. I mean, when I got involved with Indigenous solidarity work 15, 20 years ago, it was small pockets of anarchists and leftists who were doing that work, and in the last few years, as you've seen, Indigenous movements rise, that solidarity, that spirit of solidarity has spread so far and wide. And, when in Wet'suwet'en, there were blockades against a gas pipeline, it wasn't just small pockets anymore that were rising up in solidarity across the country. You saw hundreds of, high school students marching out of their schools. So when I look especially at, the younger generation of folks, the political baseline that they are starting with is so much more sophisticated and holistic than when my generation was kind of coming into political consciousness 15 years ago. And all of that is material that I think we can work with if we're smart and strategic and build organizations that can harness it and put it to effect. It's true that right now, the strength of the left is not strong enough to see political expression in electoral moments, you know? And to me, you know, the political election system is always a litmus test of how strong the left is. Once we grow stronger organizationally, I think you'll start to see shifts as well in the electoral landscape, and they really can't come fast enough.
And you know what else is really exciting and, you know, hopeful? So I'm watching different people, you know, talking about like from the different parties. And, you know, you've got the Green Party and they're there and all their people are holding their green signs and they're celebrating and I mean, it's one seat, but, you know, it's a seat for the environment. And so, you know, one step at a time, right? And the fact that they're so you know, they're so happy. And what Martin's saying, you know, about the youth, I haven't heard a single youth yet not say the following, you know, as soon as the old fogies are gone, we're changing everything. Like, I haven't met any Trump students. I mean, maybe it's because I don't live in the United States, but literally I speak in classrooms, I speak in universities, you know, I go out and speak in communities, and all of these young kids are excited about how, oh, in just a few years, they're just changing everything. And that is so very hopeful. And to see, like on Twitch, you've got kids in junior high and high school and university all talking politics, all talking about human rights and the environment and the need to organize and stand up and make change. I mean, that wasn't so popular 40 years ago. I mean, people were talking about their friends in the basketball game and no one's really paying attention to elections, but these youth are so more tuned in now than I think at any other time in history, any other time. And I think that's also really exciting.
Yeah, I mean, even when I think of coming of age, you know, 15, 20 years ago politically, the word socialism was a bad word, you know, a dirty word that you wouldn't dare utter, kind of to be whispered in hushed voices. And now, you know, socialism, eco-socialism in particular, is at the center of political debates across North America and Europe and elsewhere. And that to me is incredibly promising. You know, polls show that majority of Canadians are open to the idea of socialism. 50% are also favorable to capitalism. So it's a Canadian syndrome of being somewhat confused and torn between these ideas. But all to say, I think that there's a lot for socialists and leftists and progressive movements to work with. And, you know, someone I spoke to earlier yesterday, Dave Bush, who is an organizer with the Spring Magazine and Spring Network, pointed to a lot of, you know, concrete concessions that movements have been able to win in Ontario, including probably most prominently the minimum wage fight, which they, of course, won under the Liberals. But in Doug Ford's attempt to kind of make concessions to win this time around, he was forced again to bring that back.
Well, we actually want to go to that interview that you had with Dave Bush next. So this is a great segue for us to say goodbye to our panel again for a little while. Pam, we'll see you again before the end of the night. You're watching The Breach Show. This is our live Ontario election special. If you want to support the work we do, go to breachmedia.ca. You'll find out everything you need on how to become a sustaining member, and do subscribe to our channels on YouTube and your favorite podcasts. So yeah, yesterday, Martin, you chatted with Dave Bush. As you said, he's an organizer with Spring Magazine, and he's been canvassing with Justice for Workers in the lead up to the election. Here's the conversation they had.
David, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So you've done a lot of canvassing during the election with the Justice for Workers campaign. I'm curious, what are the issues that you're hearing are at the forefront of people's minds, and how have the different political parties connected or not connected with them?
Yeah, I think some of the issues that come up immediately when you start canvassing is cost of living. People experience, you know, the rise of prices when they go into the grocery store. They're struggling to make ends meet. And, you know, at the end of the day, like the last 2 years has hit low wage workers the hardest. Low wage workers in Ontario were the first workers to lose their jobs, see their hours cut, and really struggle through. Meanwhile, the rich got richer, their assets got pricier, and they made off like bandits. And so I think for workers, during this election, that's the thing that's materially front and center in terms of what they're thinking about and what they're trying to see addressed during the election.
I'm curious, like Doug Ford rode into power in 2018 with his shtick about being for the little guy and taking on the elite. That seemed to work quite well, kind of take in the media, certainly. How is that landing with voters that you're speaking to?
Well, so I'm in downtown Toronto, and I would say it's fair going out canvassing in most ridings in the GTA. That you're going to see a lot of skepticism, a lot of anger at Doug Ford, how Doug Ford has handled the pandemic, how Doug Ford is tight with lobbyists, how Doug Ford has rolled back, like basically paused the minimum wage, rolled back paid sick days. You're going to see a lot of that. But like if you take a step out of the GTA, I think that there are definitely more sympathy for Doug Ford out there. Doug Ford, his lowest poll ratings actually happened about this time last year, through January to May 2021, when we were going through a third and fourth wave of the pandemic. And Doug Ford basically was totally in hiding, wasn't taking action to address it, had said, we're basically in November 2020, we're over the pandemic, and then it hit us the hardest it's ever hit us. And people were dying, and and his response was to empower the police and to not provide paid sick days. And that did not go over well across the province. And it really showed a lack of, Doug Ford was not connected with where people are at and what people needed. And so I think that Doug Ford at that point and the whole government started to change tack. They brought in 3 temporary paid sick days. And then through the summer last year and through the fall and early parts of this winter, they started to bring in a whole number of bills that were, quote, working for workers. And these pieces of legislation sounded good, right? They sounded like they were taking action to protect temp workers, and taking action to prevent or to protect gig workers, and taking action to raise the minimum wage. Of course, these weren't good enough. They were long overdue, but they sounded like he was taking a softer tone. And all the rhetoric that he's been using in the lead up to the election and during the election is about getting workers back to work and protecting workers. And it's very, very different than I think last time around. And I actually think that is playing fairly well across the province, save for a couple places where there is like longstanding animosity towards Doug Ford. And I would say that would be in places like Toronto in the downtown.
Recently, the Breach published an excellent interview with Pam Frake, someone that you organized with, and she described, speaking specifically about the Green Party and the NDP, that for the first time in her life, during a campaign, her organization actually had to update their election materials, not once, but twice, as political parties started responding to kind of pressure from the grassroots. And speaking specifically about the NDP, she talked about how the NDP has finally embraced $20 minimum wage, equal pay for equal work, and 10 paid sick days, after organizers have been pushing for that for years. Can you talk about this dynamic of movements laying the groundwork for a shift from parties like the NDP?
Yeah, I think it's such an important point to note the power and importance of social movements and the labor movement writ large in creating the conditions for the left to advance. That if movements and the labor movement and social movements were just to say, vote for the NDP, we couldn't really put pressure on the political terrain and shape the discussion and advance it to the left, right? Because they would feel under no pressure to, change their positions, because they would already say, hey, we support you guys. I think in 2014, The NDP ran on increasing the minimum wage to $12 when the movement demand was $14. And they also ran on, instituting a ministry of like savings, basically a ministry of austerity. And it was a very brutal election that the NDP did not do well in. And in general, the left was not advancing or shaping the narrative in a way that helped advance workers' struggles. I think if you fast forward to this election and even a bit in the last election, that our strong movements have helped shape what kinds of issues are talked about in the lead up to the election and during the election, and to put pressure constantly on the parties to either outbid themselves, to try to have quality positions on workers' issues or issues affecting low-income Ontarians. For example, the NDP did shift its position on increasing the rates of OW and ODSP to match what the Green Party was saying. And this had been because there had been pressure from movements to do so. The NDP supports a $20 minimum wage and 10 paid sick days. The Green Party supports $20 minimum wage and 10 paid sick days. The Liberals support 10 paid sick days. This is because movements have helped shape the terrain and made the conditions for those parties to adopt those politics more tangible, more realistic. And make those issues popular. Even Ford has come out for a $15 minimum wage, and he actually raised the minimum wage in January of this year and announced it in an off-schedule minimum wage increase, because the minimum wage here is adjusted yearly to meet the cost of living in October. And this was an off-schedule raise to 15, in part because they knew the election was coming up. They knew workers that this would be a popular issue with workers to raise the minimum wage coming out of the pandemic. And it was because we collectively as movements had made that issue popular. When we started the Fight for 15 and Fairness in 2015, and there was a battle for a minimum wage for $14 before that, it wasn't automatic that workers would even support a minimum wage increase to $15 from $11.25 or whatever, or $11. Partly because where people were at when they understood raise the minimum wage, people thought that it might increase inflation, it might increase prices when they go into the store, it might cause unemployment, it might lead to the mass automation of jobs. And we had to work really hard collectively as a movement to dispel that, win people's confidence, because the other part of that is people also didn't think that was realistic. We couldn't actually achieve it. And by building people's confidence and capacity to fight, we actually changed what people thought was possible. And it then forced political parties to move their political positions on that and actually run on those kinds of positions. And that's a good thing. No matter what the outcome of the election is, that's a positive sign.
That was the first part of Martin's conversation with David Bush. Martin also asked David about what's in store with another Ford government and how social movements can best respond. Let's listen in.
Speaking of that, you wrote recently in an article that if Ford does win, he would, quote, not be winning on a confident platform of attacking workers, but because he had to retreat and claim to, in fact, be working for workers, to use the name of their act. Can you explain what you meant and what the significance of that might be as we stare down another potential 4 years of Ford?
Yeah, I think there is a difference between when a conservative or a right-wing government wins and they're promising to do very right-wing, terrible things, versus when a conservative government wins or a right-wing government wins and they're winning based on, being good to workers. It doesn't mean that they're not going to be terrible, but it's a lot harder for them to pave the way to do terrible things. They actually have to do a lot more to push those bad policies and those bad pieces of legislation, right? It doesn't mean that workers aren't going to face attacks. It just means it makes it much easier to build coalitions to resist those attacks and to help shape that conversation beforehand. There is no mandate when Ford wins. There is no mandate for him to roll back employment standards for workers. There is no mandate for him to cut ODSP and OW. There is no mandate for him to do massive cuts to public services. He's promising to end hallway medicine. He's promising, to make sure workers have jobs. Like, he is not promising to do something that Mike Harris did, right? Which is to actually cut public services, go after teachers, go after, people who are low income Ontarians.
And speaking of the kind of coalitions that might need to be built, like what is your sense of what it would take to, likely under a Ford majority, build the basis for a political alternative in Ontario? Not a small question, I guess. But...
Well, I think people on the left in Ontario need to be real. That the pandemic, it did have an impact on the left. It did have an impact on the left of people who are campaigning and who are out there, and what I call the fighting left. People who are actively out there organizing, fighting on issues, building networks, and trying to build the confidence and capacity of the class to advance, issues that we all care about. And that the pandemic really, in many ways, made those networks much smaller. And I would say a lot of people have a lot of rust about doing active political campaigning. And the left, I think, is a lot smaller than people wish it was in Ontario. And I think, the way in which we're going to, stop Ford and stop Ford's agenda and take on the big business lobby is to be able to reforge those networks, is to actually build a left that is campaigning on issues, that is winning popular support for those issues. Because it's not just a matter of the NDP or political parties saying radical things or things I would like to hear. It is a matter of that those have an echo in the broader class, that people are already won to those ideas, and that parties are there amplifying those issues and building out of that. And our job, I think, on the left, the fighting left, is to get in there and to keep building our networks, like where we live, where we work, and expand them across the province. In every nook and cranny, build people's confidence and capacity to fight back, to be organizers. And I think that that's our task. And so that's why I'm involved in the Justice for Workers campaign. I think there's a number of other good campaigns that are out there, and that we need to keep building each other up and find new people to organize. Don't be insular. And I think that that is a key lesson on the left, is to let's not talk to ourselves. Let's go out there. Let's talk to other workers. Let's find new people, build their confidence and capacity up, and get people talking, leading with issues, and get people involved through action. And in that way, I think that we will be able to forge the kind of networks of people who are willing to make this province better.
Well, David, here's to shaking off some of that rust. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
That was Dave Bush, an organizer with Spring Magazine. We want to take you now to listen in live to Doug Ford's victory speech. We're going to try and get that on your screens. He has just started giving his victory speech at his headquarters. Okay, so as you can see, we're having some technical difficulties here. We'll get that back up for you as soon as we have figured out what the problem is. In the meantime, Martin, I know you've been slowly checking some of the candidates we've been watching. I'll have you update us on a couple of them while we wait for that fix.
Well, I think for those who aren't watching Doug Ford give a chest-thumping victory speech, many of the candidates, NDP progressive candidates that we were watching in downtown Toronto have mostly won. There's still a few races too close to call. And also in the Southwest Ontario, several NDP candidates have held on to their ridings as well, which is exciting to see. It's interesting that Doug Ford has again broken with political etiquette and done his speech before all the concession speeches were done. Probably pretty smart political tactics on his part. People seem to go in for that kind of stuff. And
I'm getting word that it might be fixed, so let's try again. And if the audio is not working, we do have closed captioning. So let's see if we can get that up again.
Look at that crowd. It definitely reflects this.
Well, welcome back after that victory speech from Doug Ford. Striking an interesting balance between language of inclusion with the pretty traditional conservative business politics, hearing echoes of the open for business politics of the Harris years. I was also struck by how he, situated his politics in a kind of 3-decade arc, which has been, as he mentioned, transformative, but not for the better for the province of Ontario. A hard right, neoliberal right-wing project starting with the Harris years that has created an incredible amount of hardship for people across the province. And likely, if movements don't rise to the occasion, we'll see more of that as well. I want to turn now to a conversation I had yesterday with Linda McQuaig, the longtime author, journalist, and author most recently of The Sport and Prey of Capitalists: How the Rich Are Stealing Canada's Public Wealth. She's someone who has tracked the privatization push in this country and in Ontario. And I asked her about Doug Ford's passion for privatizing, creating opportunities for private profiteering, and what we might expect from him next. Linda, as we look down the barrel of another 4 years of Doug Ford, I wanted to explore the privatization push that we've seen under his government. You've written that Doug Ford's, quote, zeal for privatization runs deep. Handing over our public services to money-making private operators isn't just part of his agenda, it's in his DNA. Can you start by taking us through the impact privatization has had on nursing homes, which, as we all know, became death traps during the pandemic?
Yeah, nursing homes for sure have been the worst area. He just does privatization everywhere he goes. The idea of just handing over profits to the private sector, that's just deep in his bones. Even though it's just much better for us as citizens and residents to have services delivered publicly. It just, we don't need to pay a premium in the form of profits to a private operator. Now, in terms of nursing homes, it's just been a disaster. First of all, the big push for privatization began under Mike Harris, back in the 90s. Mike Harris, another conservative, very much in the lines with Doug Ford. And up until then, nursing homes had been either small little private operations or publicly operated. And under Harris, he really pushed privatization in order to open the field for all kinds of profit making. And of course, we know Mike Harris himself jumped in and became involved in Chartwell as the chairman, making huge profits, for one of these private nursing home chains. So it was always the privatization, the private nursing homes have always been a problem, but they became a real problem during COVID. because the conditions just weren't as good, and the care the staff levels were lower, and as a result, the death rates in private nursing homes in Ontario were 5 times higher from COVID than they were in the public nursing homes. So that's just disastrous. And then he's compounding that problem because, now, having learned nothing from the COVID crisis, they're having to expand nursing home capacity in Ontario. There's need for more beds. And they've allocated, they're creating something like 30,000 new beds, of which more than half have been allocated to these very private sector nursing home chains that had such a disastrous record in terms of COVID death rate. So, that's what we're going to see in 4 more years of Ford, for sure.
Where else is Ford kind of training his privatization target on?
Well, another big area of concern is Ontario already has a lot of private medical clinics that typically do diagnostic tests, that kind of thing. So, for instance, if you're getting screened for, if you're having to have a colonoscopy or something, a lot of that is now privatized. It's publicly paid for, but it's a private operator making profits from that. Now, okay, so we have a lot of these private medical clinics, but Christine Elliott, the health minister, actually kind of inadvertently, I think, announced during the, just before the campaign, the election campaign began, that they were planning to deal with the huge medical backlog because of COVID. They're planning to deal with that by allowing these private medical clinics to operate as private hospitals. And what that means is that they wouldn't just be doing diagnostic procedures, they'd be doing surgeries. And that is a really, really serious line that they'd be crossing, because all the way back in 1973, the province actually banned private hospitals because they considered that, something as important as surgery should be done in a public hospital. We had private hospitals somewhat before then, and they were banned after 1973. So clearly what Ford is planning to do is to open that door once again to private hospitals. But of course, they don't want to draw attention to that before the election. So even though there's been some reporting on that, they always sort of try and imply that no, that's not really the case. That is the case, and the minister is actually on tape saying it.
Take me through what's happening with the public school system as well. We know that provincial funding of schools is already $800 less per student than it was when Ford first came into office. What's happening on that front?
Well, and of course, we only know that number that you just cited because the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives did some crunching of the numbers. The Ford government never admits that they've cut back spending in education. But in fact, what they've done is, they've cut that back $800 per student across the province, which is unbelievable when you think about it. Think of how much better off our schools could be if they had an extra $800 per student. That's $800 less per student than the amount per student 4 years ago when Doug Ford came to power. And I guess, maybe the best way to say it is to point out that Ontario has the lowest program spending of any of the provinces in Canada, which is weird because Ontario's a rich province. But if you look at it per capita, you find that Ontario spends less per capita on its programs, on its public programs, than any of the other provinces. So, for instance, if we just spent in Ontario, if we just spent on public programs the equivalent of the national average of the other provinces, we'd be spending an extra $28 billion a year. I mean, that's just a phenomenal difference. $28 billion basically to go to healthcare and education. You can imagine the difference it would make. I mean, one way to illustrate it is that the total education budget for Ontario is only $30 billion a year. The total health budget is 71 billion, I think. So that's about 100 billion, and we'd have an extra 28 billion if we were spending the most of any province, if we were just spending the national average, like what the averages of all the other provinces. That's just stunning. Like, why would we want to be stuck in this, this trench where we're lower than all the other provinces, even though we are one of the richest provinces? It's all part of that privatization agenda, that you underfund all the public services. And so then people feel the need to get the services privately, and that creates all kinds of profit opportunities for the private sector.
You're watching The Breach Show. This is our live election special for the Ontario election, and you've just been watching a conversation that Martin Lukács has been having with Linda McQuaig, the author and journalist. They were talking about how Ford has been basically engaging in street fights with teachers and nurses. But when it comes to the corporate sector and corporate interests, he's got his kitty gloves on, and there's no better example of that than how he dealt recently with the private owners of Highway 407. Linda says it's a scandal that's even bigger than the gas plant fiasco that brought down Liberal Premier Dalton McGuinty, and it's a sign of things to come. Let's watch more of their interview together.
So while Ford has been an attack dog with public sector workers, he doesn't seem to have quite the same verve when negotiating with the corporate world. In your latest column in The Star, you cover his dealings with the owners of Highway 407, and you say that this could very well have been an opportunity for Ford to win something back for commuters. But what happened?
Yeah. Okay. Well, the story is that the owners of the 407 highway had been privatized under Mike Harris, and the owners of that highway have been just gouging commuters in Ontario for the past 20 years since they got the contract. With their gouging commuters with their very high toll rates. And it so happened that because of the pandemic, for actually not that complicated reasons, their traffic was down, and that violated their contract. So as a result of that, they actually owed the Ontario government $1 billion in penalties, which would have been fantastic. I mean, for all these years we've been gouged by this company. They owed us $1 billion. So at the very least, we should have collected that $1 billion. But no, the Ford government chose not to. They had secret negotiations with the company. The company asked to not pay them, and totally secretly, the Ford government allowed them to be forgiven the $1 billion. Even worse was the fact that if they didn't want to collect the $1 billion, if the Ford government didn't want to collect it, what they could have done was use that $1 billion debt that essentially the 407 owners had to the government, and use that to demand that the 407 drop its toll rates dramatically. Like, what we really want to achieve is to be able to reduce the congestion on the 401 so that they can use the 407 as an alternate route. And if they had done that, if the Ford government had pressured and demanded that either you pay that $1 billion or you dramatically reduce the tolls on the 407, then that would have totally basically solved the problem of a relief route, and therefore not have See, the Ford government is saying, no, we need a new relief route. We're going to call the 413. So they want to spend $10 billion building a new relief route when we already have one, but we just don't use it because the tolls are so high that only basically the very well-to-do can afford to use the 407. If we basically had the 407 owners by the scruff of the neck, and we just let them go, we just let them walk away. No, we'll be tough on nurses, that's for sure. We'll demand that nurses, be held to a wage increase way below inflation. But when it comes to the corporate owners of the 407, oh, you're struggling with the pandemic. Okay, we'll forgive you. We'll forgive you the $1 billion you owe us, and we won't even ask anything in return. Just go and be happy. I mean, that's just stunning. And to me, that is way worse, actually, than the gas plant fiasco that brought down Dalton McGuinty. This is way worse because this actually could have solved a really pressing problem we have that has bedeviled us here in Ontario ever since Mike Harris privatized the 407. And I cannot believe that this has not become a huge issue, that Doug Ford did nothing to get that $1 billion. I'm very disturbed where we are right now.
Well, Linda, I appreciate your sober and scathing assessment. Always helpful. So thanks so much for joining us. That was author and journalist Linda McQuaig speaking to me yesterday. My next guest is Myles Krauter, who's an organizer and campaigner who works in the office of Ottawa councillor Shawn Menard. He's also a former ONDP candidate. And Myles, like me, you might have just heard Andrea Horwath give her concession speech in which she announced that she will be resigning as the leader of the NDP. Myles, sounds like you're at Joel Harden's either headquarters or victory party. Tell me, before we get into discussing the future of the NDP, tell me what the mood is like at the campaign party for Joel Harden.
Well, Martin, there's just so much to say. People are just feeling it's electric here. The atmosphere is electric. Folks knew the Ford government was going to return, unfortunately, but the local results were better than anybody had expected. I think we're probably one of the leading, one of the biggest margins for the NDP in the entire province is here in Ottawa Centre. We've built on our 2018 results, despite there not being momentum for the NDP overall provincially. So we're feeling thrilled about that. I just want to say Linda McQuaig was my first donation to the NDP, was for Linda McQuaig. So really love to see her just on before me there. And we're at the victory party, if that's not clear. And you know what, Martin, I didn't actually hear that about Andrea Horwath, so thank you for sharing it with me.
Happy to do that. Tell me a little bit about Joel's success, because I think activists in Ottawa have been building a really impressive socialist electoral machine. Talk about what the work looks like that has gone into electing a socialist like Joel.
There's no magic sauce here, really, Martin. It's thousands and thousands of face-to-face conversations on a mass scale about real, authentic political issues. We're campaigning with people against austerity, and we're leading with that. We're not leading with Joel's resume. We're not leading with, the product of some communications analysis. These aren't tested messages. We're testing them, I suppose, at the doors ourselves. But this is not marketing science. We're going door to door on a mass scale. We have well over 20,000 conversations on this campaign. We made well over 150,000 phone calls here in Ottawa Centre alone. There's no real secret to this. We put in the work. We're authentic, and we talk to people because we want to shift politics. We're not doing voter ID. We want to shift politics in this city to build power for the left and to build power for our community. So that's what we've been doing for years now, and we've seen victories at the electoral level as a result.
Yeah, you alluded to, the strategies that seem to dominate the approach of the NDP at its center, in the leader's office, provincially and federally. We might joke that today's NDP is like 3 consultancy agencies wearing a trench coat. The party is incredibly top down. It doesn't really empower grassroots membership or, social movement partners. Candidates like Joel Harden do it differently. And I'm curious now, having heard that, Andrea Horvat is stepping down, what kind of lessons does the organizing that you're doing in Ottawa Centre with Joel Harden's campaign, what does that offer the NDP and what they should be doing in the future?
I think it's time that we start investing in people, in communities, in the membership. We can't continue to treat members of our party like ATMs and like people who show up once every few years to run election campaigns. We need to actually build a democratic environment where there's a point to being engaged, where conventions, actually are deliberative bodies, where meetings locally actually are towards an end other than elect the NDP. And that's exactly the model we've been trying to make work here in Ottawa Centre with quite a degree of success, I would argue. And I think we also have to start treating voters as more than just voters, as more than just, subjects of a poll or of marketing science, of a focus group. These are people who are complex individuals who have various reasons for voting the way that they do. Let's start talking to them honestly, earnestly, about what matters in their lives. And let's start inviting them to participate. And as soon as we have a party that there's a meaningful reason to get involved with us, and I think it's hard for us to make that ask right now. And hopefully the party's going to change in such a way that it's very meaningful to get involved with the NDP. We're not just demanding more from politics, we're demanding more from each other too. And that means people need to actually get involved if we're going to shift politics in this province.
And what it might be a little early to ask you this, but what would you like to see in a new NDP leader of Ontario?
I'd like to see somebody lead this party that's not interested in the cult of leadership, which I think we've seen not just in the NDP but in all parties. This is a very common phenomenon in the political landscape in Ontario and beyond. There's a lot of emphasis on who the leader is, and isn't it exciting that the leader said this or the leader went here? No, the slogan on this campaign is our first slogan in 2018 was "It's about us and it's about building the strength of us," and we've shortened it now to "It's about us" this time around. But I think that's
echoes of Bernie there almost.
Well, Martin, we had Becky Bond down here doing a canvas training back in 2017.
That's an advisor to Bernie Sanders, yeah.
And we were using that line then before it was a Bernie line. So I don't
really?
I don't know what happened, but we said it first, Martin.
So many good things do start in Canada. We often get neglected as originators of exciting ideas, including the Green New Deal, which also had its origins in Canada as the LEAP Manifesto.
Great minds think alike, I think. And no, we need an NDP that's serious about building power, not just winning elections, right? There's a difference, and Joel often says this as well. There's a difference between winning an election and winning power. Those are not the same thing. You can win even if you win an election on some sort of, campaign air war. What are you actually going to do with it? What are you going to do in power if you don't have an organized community to back you up? When you're sitting across the table from capital and government, you can't air war your way out of these situations. So, there's a difference between winning elections and focusing solely on that and actually building power as part of that broader project.
Miles, well, I don't want to hold you back anymore from the party going on behind you.
Yeah.
Well deserved. So I'll let you go to enjoy that. And thanks so much for taking time to talk to us tonight.
Thank you so much to The Breach. I love what you folks are doing. Thanks for having me.
We appreciate that, Miles. Thanks so much. Take care.
It's time to bring back Pam, who I believe is still with us. There you are, Pam. Pam, this is a crushing majority. I mean, we're talking about 82 seats, 40% of the votes. And the last statistic I read about voter turnout was that it was around 48%, which is, so we say crushing victory, but I mean, we have 40% of 48% of the population voting for the Conservatives. But there were some notable upsets. Stephen Del Duca did not win his seat in his riding of Vaughan Woodbridge. The Liberals so far don't have official, they will not have official opposition status. And Andrea Horwath has announced that she's stepping down as leader. What else has been striking you, Pam, as you've been watching?
Well, I've been watching and checking out the social media, and I think, this tweet summed it up best.
Let's hear it.
Breaking news. Ontario loses the 2022 provincial election. and I have to wholeheartedly agree.
I have a feeling that's CBC pitchbot.
Yeah, exactly. And then the second one, which is
guess.
from the Beaverton, is Liberals and NDP celebrate defeating each other. It just keeps getting better and better and better and better.
Well, we've always got humor to keep us going.
I know. And basically, Doug Ford's got a proven formula. Buck a beer and free car stickers, and you can win an election. I mean, it's literally all of these little things, because he didn't do anything monumentous on anything else. But I really think it's a combination of whatever they did and just the utter failures of the NDP. I mean, Andrea was like way over her time, and Del Duca was like nowhere to be seen. I mean, anyone who worked in communications or public relations would have known that Del Duca just wasn't going to cut it. He doesn't have the personality for it. He would never connect with people. And I mean, it's very clear.
Yeah. And you really hit it on the nail, I thought, earlier when you said that Doug Ford, I think it was you who said it, pretty much made himself sparse during the whole campaign. Like, he didn't make media appearances. He just went around smiling and shaking people's hands. That, I think, was a pretty effective strategy.
Yeah, well, exactly, because then you can't hold yourself to account for anything. You just ride the wave of, I mean, because keep in mind, over his tenure here, he was, I mean, between him and Jason Kenney, they were the most hated premiers all across Canada for the last few years. I mean, and it wasn't even that long ago. I think it was in March that his approval ratings went down to 35. But people have short memories. They clearly have short memories. All of the, cronyism, all of the investigations, all of the allegations, all of the, everything that's happened, how miserably he handled the pandemic. And, it only takes a few months of not saying anything and taking those risks, and people forget about it. And it's like, well, you know what? Who's going to vote for Del Duca? Andrea Horwath hasn't been able to connect. So they didn't give voters any options.
And they benefited from the low voter turnout and the fact that these other parties were so uninspiring. I'm wondering, Martin, what you think is the future of NDP from here post Horwath?
Well, I mean, I've been searching for silver linings all night, as I like to do. And to me, I think one of the positives coming out is a consecutive poor showing for the Liberal Party of Ontario, I think, is really excellent. I mean, the Liberals often get called the natural governing party of Canada. To me, they're more like the unnatural governing party. That they have whether federally or provincially, they are often in power, especially in recent years in Ontario, not so much historically. But I think it's good to consign them to where they belong. They talk about being the center, but often they, mix socially progressive policies with, pretty hard right economic ones. And I think it's exciting that there might be a more natural, political electoral system emerging in Ontario. That said, I really wish it were happening with the NDP offering something that is concretely distinct from the other parties. And as was mentioned earlier by more than a few guests and panelists, they did that in terms of their platform, but they didn't do that in any thoroughgoing way in terms of campaigning year round, in terms of the kind of platform that they would give to social movement perspectives and voices. In fact, if anything, the party remains quite hostile and fearful around the energy that social movements can provide. And they really often muzzle any real creativity and boldness from within the staffer class, within the grassroots membership. And I'm hoping that this, moment now with Horwath stepping down could see, a candidate or two even emerge who can actually put bold politics and policies on the table, and not just policies, but also the need to democratize the party and to really shift in terms of how it operates day to day, week to week, and in between campaigns, connecting with people. Like, as Miles was saying, not just as an ATM. If anyone's ever signed up to an NDP listserv, they know that most of the emails they send are just to get funds from their members. And that really needs to change. It really needs to, if it wants to have and play a really important role as a vehicle for progressive transformative policies, it really needs to play a role as a vehicle for campaigning year round, so that people have a sense that it's actually fighting for their interests, not just at election time, but year round. So I think this opening hopefully can be seized by movements and the progressive left.
Pam, what will you be looking for in the post-Horwath NDP?
I'm going to go play World of Warcraft because I don't think in any near future the NDP has what it takes to look at themselves critically. If they had, then they would have gotten rid of Andrew Horwath, and they would have been, more outreach, and they would have, admitted when they weren't doing good and focused on the things that they were. I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. The NDP, in I don't know, recent years, seems to have this inability to look at itself critically and make key changes. So they failed. They left this wide open for the Conservatives. And I mean, Stephen Del Duca was never, ever, ever going to win this. Someone should have told him in the Liberal Party. And so if you've got these parties who are trying to be what they always were, do things as they always did, it's not gonna fly, because the right wingers, the far right, have all that populist movement. They have all those crazy social tricks that they use to engender support. Well, the NDP and the Liberals are going to really have to get with the times and figure out how to reach, young people in communities and talk to people where they're at. And you just can't do politics like you've always done it. They're stuck in the dark ages, unfortunately. And unless they haul themselves out with some kind of alternative to this far right movement, I don't see anything happening soon. And that's why, I'm going to go play World of Warcraft.
That's a little bit better than just wearing black and mourning all night.
Yeah, it is what it is. I can just get into my jammies. I got my World of Warcraft thing here. I'm good to go.
I love it. Final closing thoughts?
I mean, I think that the task remains for the left, as Raymond Williams once put it, which is that the task is not to make despair convincing, but hope practical. And on a night like this, where an assault from an empowered right-wing government looms for the next few years, I think it's going to take a lot of spirit to gather our forces and to prepare ourselves for the fights to come.
And ultimately, we're one day closer to Doug Ford being out of office. So there's always that.
There is always that. Yeah, a lot to watch for. And I hope that people watching at home found some of our conversations to be thought-provoking and useful. I mean, we covered a lot of ground, from climate to Indigenous rights and consultation to mining and development to Ford's privatization agenda, whether that's in the school system, long-term care, the rights of workers, migrant workers. And we'll be watching all of these issues closely for the next 4 years and documenting the fight back against Ford's agenda. Thanks to everyone who tuned in. We hope you appreciated the program, and we hope you continue to follow and support our work. We had a small but pretty mighty team bringing you this ambitious program for tonight. So please consider donating so we can keep this kind of programming going. Go to breachmedia.ca and you'll find all the information you need. And if you haven't yet subscribed to our YouTube channel or our podcast, how about you do it now? Go to breachmedia.ca/the show and you can find the info there. I'll sign off for all of us now here at the show. I'm Donya Ziai. Martin, Pam, see you next time.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.